move was
to seek refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy, which really was the beginning of the new chapter in his life and what we're dealing with now, which is him being stuck in London.
what was supposed to be an office in an embassy is now Assange's self-imposed prison to this very day. But that doesn't mean he's slowed down. Since being trapped in the embassy, WikiLeaks has released files about Guantanamo Bay prisoners, Syrian political figures, and the draft to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then came the 2016 U.S. election.
Thousands of leaked emails showed Democratic Party officials possibly plotting against Bernie Sanders in his race against Hillary Clinton.
Over the course of 68 days, WikiLeaks released 20,000 confidential Democratic National Committee emails. In terms of the presidential race, if you look right here, when Assange released the first batch of emails, Trump actually takes his first lead against Clinton.
I think we've had enough of the Clintons, in all fairness.
Once WikiLeaks started exposing secrets of the Democratic Party, Julian Assange became a hero to many on the right. Public opinion kind of flip-flopped.
WikiLeaks.
From the emails, we now know Hillary Clinton's campaign manager makes risotto, and also how the DNC squashed Bernie Sanders' campaign. One thing we don't know is who gave Assange the stolen emails in the first place.
Many leading Democrats say they suspect it was the Russians. They released an analysis from a private cybersecurity firm that had said it was the Russians.
But Assange claims
our source is not the Russian government, and it is not a state party.
So this is where we stand today. The public still doesn't know who provided the emails to WikiLeaks. Meanwhile, Assange is still running WikiLeaks and still releasing documents. In March 2017, he started publishing documents from the CIA's Center for Cyber Intelligence called Vault 7.
The CIA, the agency charged with finding and keeping our top secrets, can't keep its own secrets.
As long as Assange has a connection to the world, no government secret will be too far from exposure.
Julian Assange is still in the embassy. Maybe he'll leave, maybe he won't. Kind of regardless, his work has been done. He's changed the way people think about their governments, about their own secrets, about their own hackability, and really the world has changed because of him.
expose everything you won't admit.
And action.
This entire video is based on a true story. When I do like motivational speeches or even tell myself like, love yourself and you should love yourself.
This is Lily Singh, but to fans all over the world, she's the YouTube star Superwoman.
What if everyone's a girl? Superwoman.
I know we can change the world for the better, one positive day at a time.
My parents now know what I do. They didn't know what I did for a long time in the beginning of my career. I was just making videos in my room. They had no idea.
Mom, Dad, have you seen my keys? I can't find them anywhere. Because you're always on phone.
Until someone called them, like a family member from another part of Canada, was like, Canada, is your daughter making videos? And I think my mom was like, I don't know, Lily, are you making videos?
Just making videos grew into an entire career. Today, Lily's YouTube channel has some 12 million subscribers, over 2 billion views, and guest stars like Michelle Obama, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and Seth Rogen.
I think a lot of young girls are raised to believe that you're going to go to school and then graduate and then get married and then get a job and then have kids.
And Lily was on that path, all the way through a psychology degree at York University in Toronto. But when she started thinking about a career,
I started to immensely panic and think something was wrong with me because I tried to figure out my life and it wasn't working in that straight line.
It was 2010, and YouTube was only 5 years old.
I thought nothing of YouTube. I was probably the last person in my circle of friends to discover YouTube. And I remember when I did, I thought, this is so strange. There's people making videos in their rooms and other people are watching them.
So she figured, why not give it a shot?
I one day posted a video because I was sad and I wanted to be creative and happy.
She didn't know how to edit video or write scripts, so she winged it.
It was so bad and so cringe. And my expectation was literally nothing. I was like, I'm gonna put this video up. A couple of my friends are gonna watch it, probably make fun of me, and that's gonna be the end of this. The second and third video came from, wait, 70 people watched my first one. Can I get 80 to watch the next one?
She kept creating, she kept posting, and the viewers kept coming. Lily had found an audience.
A lot of the comments were, oh my God, there's a brown girl on YouTube.
More specifically, Indian. Lily's parents immigrated to Canada from India, and Lily was born and raised in Scarborough, near Toronto.
My home life was awesome. My parents, even though I portrayed them to be quite strict in my videos.
Oi, Lily, where the rest of your skirt, huh? I teach you like this, to walk around like this, showing everything to everyone?
They actually aren't like that at all. They're pretty modern and pretty cool.
Your dress is short. Don't know what for.
And were pretty lenient with me. I mean, I got away with a lot of things. I was a brat. I was a brat.
She had a different idea of what she wanted out of life than other kids. In a grade school graduation slideshow, her classmates said they wanted to be lawyers and doctors.
And then I came up and I was like, rapper.
Making out with your friends, man. But then you say that you hate hoes.
I could just feel my parents being like, why?
Because that's just not something women really did in the Singh family.
I know there was a ton of people that weren't happy about my birth being a female, so I think, and that's some real-ish, but it's a real thing. The best thing I could have done to prove to so many people that didn't want my mom to have a daughter was to become Superwoman.
What up, everyone? It's your girl, Superwoman.
It was the name of Lily's favorite hip-hop song by Lil Mo featuring Fabulous.
I love the song so much because it was one of the only songs at the time that was an empowering female song, where Lil Mo's going on about, like, I will save guys with my superpowers, and I will save girls with my superpowers, and I am the Superwoman. I thought, this name that I've had for so long that empowered me when I was younger, I'm gonna make this my screen name.
Maybe there should be a new series.
Superwoman didn't just burst onto the scene overnight with a viral video. It was a steady climb fueled by hard work.
The moment that I thought this is going somewhere and this could be a career was the first time I performed internationally. It was in India. And it was the first time where I was truly across the world and people knew my videos.
Singh has transformed herself from a bratty kid to an internet personality to a media mogul. She started a feature film, A Trip to Unicorn Island, in 2016. And her book, How to Be a Boss, hit the New York Times bestseller list in 2017 while she was on a 30-city international tour. Lily started out with the goal of getting millions of subscribers and financial security.
Hurry the hell up.
But after surpassing those goals, success has new meaning.
I've really come to terms with the fact that my definition of success is what's the best legacy I can leave behind. And it's not the number of views and the number of subscribers. It is the number of people that can say, this girl changed my life or changed something in my life positively.
CTE is often found in the brains of deceased athletes, military veterans, and others with a history of repetitive brain trauma. Hundreds have donated their brains to the VA Boston University Concussion Legacy Foundation Brain Bank.
This is a former NFL player who died in his early 70s, and this is a veteran who also died in his early 70s.
Dr. Ann McKee dissects these brains.
The hippocampus and the mammillary bodies are very important for memory. I can see that they're slightly affected.
McKee recently dissected the brain of former New England Patriots player Aaron Hernandez, who was convicted of murder and later committed suicide.
You'll see right away that the brain is showing signs of shrinkage. You can see the crevices in the brain that you can't see in the normal.
McKee says Hernandez's severe case of CTE impacted his decision-making, depression, and ability to control rage and aggression. Right now, she thinks we're underestimating how many people have CTE.
We were able to distinguish between CTE and controls and CTE and Alzheimer's disease. The next question is, can we do this in the blood, and can we do this in living people? And we aren't there yet with those answers.
But the need for a diagnosis in the living is motivating companies such as Quanterix in Lexington, Massachusetts, to work faster on technology that could diagnose concussions and CTE in as few as 30 minutes. Kevin Rosovsky is the CEO.
It's like a high-powered microscope. And so by doing that, we can see little biomarkers that you couldn't see before in the blood.
Quanterix received a grant from the NFL and just went public. Since then, its stock is up more than 40%. The company sells a machine called Simoa for $175,000 to other biotechs, hospitals, and researchers.
And for the first time in history, we're able to see brain health in blood, and that's a major breakthrough, and that's leading to less invasive testing, and we've already been able to see evidence of concussions, and there's the beginning evidence of being able to see the accumulated effect of concussions.
Quanterix is also trying to detect Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, and ALS. Rosovsky says he thinks diagnosing concussions will be easier than diagnosing CTE.
Diagnosing CT in the living probably is a couple years away. We're real excited to see the progress, but reducing some of that work into actual tests in a laboratory takes time. There's regulatory approvals. There's a lot of red tape that you have to go through.
Also in this race to diagnose CTE in the blood are Athlon Medical and Exosome Sciences. And New York's Mount Sinai Hospital is scanning for the disease in the living. But it's just one step in a series of questions for those with serious head trauma. There's still no cure for CTE.
Even if we had a great idea for a treatment, there's no way to test whether it's effective or not. So that's the enormous advance that we'll get if we can develop a biomarker for this disease.
In Boston, Ann Mostu, Bloomberg News.
Wine is a $300 billion global industry where one person's opinion can make fortunes or break them. That's because of this man, Robert Parker, and his newsletter, The Wine Advocate. For 3 decades, he dominated as the world's most influential wine critic. Now Parker's protege is building an empire of his own. Antonio Galloni runs Venice.
Antonio, tell me, what are you trying to build at Venice?
Well, at Venice, we started with the idea in 2013 of building a world-class platform. We have a database of about 250,000 professionally written reviews. On Delectable, we have 7 million user reviews. Through Delectable, we also have a partnership with Whole Foods and several other partnerships that we can't announce just yet. And when you put that all together, what we have is something that no other company in our space can even come close to.
Do you think of yourself as the next Parker?
Not at all.
Why?
Because Steve Jobs said you can't live your life trying to be somebody else. So he's one of my biggest influences, and I've never wanted to be a replica of somebody else because a replica is never as good as the original. Bob is a genius, fantastic, one of a kind. We're going to be something completely different, and I have no desire to be some version of somebody else.
Different in what way?
Every decision that I've made at this company is completely anathemic to what Bob did with his company. I want our writers to be partners. All of my senior people are locked into the company. They all have equity or they have a path to equity based on business results. That's something that we never had at Parker. Our benefits are world-class, and everything that we've done at Venice is completely different from that model. When Steve Tanzer, who is the most experienced active wine critic in America, wants to work with us, that says something. When Alessandro Masnaghetti, who's the best cartographer of vineyards, wants to work with us, that says something. When Neil Martin, who's a superstar wine critic with enormous experience in Bordeaux and Burgundy and the former lead critic at The Advocate, wants to come and be part of our team, that says something.
You make it sound like The Wine Advocate was a disaster as a company and a miserable experience as an employee.
No, it was great because I got to work with Bob Parker when he was at his prime, you know, and Bob was like a second father to me, and we talked on the phone all the time, and he gave me great advice.
Can anyone's palate dominate the wine criticism business the way Parker's did? And should anyone's palate dominate it the way his did?
I just think the world is very different today. You know, it's just a totally different world. It's probably not healthy to have a single person dominating the world.
It's not even wine criticism, it's the wine industry.
Yeah, that's probably not the healthiest thing in the world. But I think that there's just such an opportunity right now with social media and technology to reach such a massive number of people that I think it's possible that 1 or 2 people will actually have more influence than Bob Parker did, because they will, again, this goes back to your first question, not trying to be a version of somebody else. You see this in sports all the time. It's like, oh, well, nobody will ever beat this record. And then somebody comes along, you know, it's like tennis, Pete Sampras. Nobody's ever going to win as many Grand Slams. Now you have 2 guys who are ahead of that and 1 knocking on the door. And so I think a lot like that.
You're a former investment banker. How does that inform and influence what you're doing and what you've done?
My generation has had to deal with a lot more challenges. That's why I think we're actually much better poised for the future. My first job in finance, the first thing that happened was long-term capital, 1998. Then the tech bubble melted down. Then there was a mutual fund trading scandal. You know, that was all like within about 5 or 6 years. And these are the things that I had to deal with as a young executive. My peers who were 20 years older didn't know how to manage in crisis. They'd only seen Black Monday. They'd just been in a big bull market. It's very different. So I'm very lucky. People of my generation or a little bit younger have actually had to deal with a lot more crises. I think that's actually good for learning how to cope with challenges in business.
From the outside, it kind of looks like you're trying to demolish the house that Parker built, right? You left The Wine Advocate.
Yeah.
You merged with one of his chief rivals.
Yeah.
And you just hired his successor, Neil Martin.
Mm-hmm.
So are you?
I think what that says is that all the best people want to work at our company. And that's really what we strive to create starting in 2013. We wanted to create a world-class company that would attract the best-in-class talent, and not just on the content side, on the technology side, on the digital side, our office, and at every level, what we're trying to, we only hire superstars, and we're looking for those superstars.
In the world of professional wrestling, there's something called a swerve.
Hulk Hogan has been trained WCW.
Some examples. These tag team partners are called babyfaces, or the good guys. Then one of them swerves when he super kicks his tag team partner in the head, quickly assuming the role of the bad guy, or what the wrestling world calls the heel.
Are you kidding? What a despicable act that was!
Or a match is almost lost when, what's that? The superstar wrestler appears out of nowhere sprinting down the aisle to save the match.
It's the Warriors music! It's the Ultimate Warrior!
That's a swerve. So it should go as no surprise that World Wrestling Entertainment, known as the WWE, the most popular brand of sports entertainment in the world, is prepared for any swerves that come their way. So here's the story of how the WWE learned to see the swerve coming. So I spoke to Bloomberg reporters Felix Gillette.
I'm a writer for Bloomberg News for the global business team.
And Kim Basine.
And I'm the U.S. luxury reporter at Bloomberg.
To find out exactly how the WWE is positioning itself for an all-out global invasion, which starts with a massive change to their lucrative pay-per-view model.
WWE basically pioneered the pay-per-view model on cable. I remember as a kid, when the pay-per-view events came up, all of our friends would scramble around and try and get one of the parents to pay for it.
But in 2014, they took a huge risk.
They saw a little bit sooner than some of the other entertainment brands that where this whole thing was moving was away from cable and satellite television and towards on-demand streaming video apps. They made this risky decision, in essence, cannibalizing that pay-per-view model, which they had essentially built.
And after some early turbulence, it's working. Roughly 1.5 million people are paying $9.99 a month for the WWE app, making it the 5th most popular streaming OTT service. This adapt-or-die approach is in the WWE's DNA. Over the past 30 years, the company always seems to think 2 steps ahead. In the early 90s,
WWE was at its most threatened when Ted Turner took them on with WCW,
which stands for World Championship Wrestling. And back then, the WCW was winning the ratings war. So in order to compete with them,
WWE had changed its product from a family-friendly kind of cartoonish style to this really raw. That's why they called their show Raw. It was this raw style of wrestling.
With violent, outrageous, reality-inspired plot lines and aggressive personas.
From a 16-foot ladder!
And they won that fight against Ted Turner. And they bought WCW.
The early 2000s ushered in an era of testosterone-driven programming aimed at the red-blooded American male.
Bra and panties matches, and people smash each other over their head with like barbed wire bats and things like that.
Until 2015, when WWE fans started a hashtag Give Divas a Chance. Since then, WWE has hired 40 more female wrestlers, and that growing cast of female characters was part of a much larger plan.
They started to try to appeal to a broader set of people.
Let's attract more female fans. And after we've attracted more female fans, let's attract more international fans. They're broadening their base, and they're doing that in large part to make it more advertising friendly.
And not just friendly to advertisers.
They're trying to build up their fan base in China. They're trying to build up their fan base in Europe. They, already have a pretty good fan base in India.
India is a place where they already have an established wrestling culture.
Because of the gigantic Indian wrestler, the Great Khali. But there's still a lot of work to do. While the WWE set a revenue record in 2017, only 30% of it is coming from an overseas audience. And there's one person whose responsibility is to grow that number.
The buck eventually stops at Vince McMahon, no matter what's happening within WWE.
Yeah, he's a very controlling guy, and it's a very, very, very tightly scripted company.
And that goes all the way down the board to big stars' entrance music. And their outfits and things like that.
So with a CEO like McMahon always planning 2 moves ahead and an aggressive push into multiple international markets, a big issue is money.
It's hard to do all those things simultaneously without committing a huge amount of capital to it.
And that's where the WWE becomes an attractive company for buyers.
Potentially, one thing that could happen with WWE is they could benefit by being acquired by a bigger technology or telecom company, an Amazon or Facebook Facebook or a 21st Century Fox.
So with a market cap of $2.8 billion, the advantage of owning 100% of their own content, and a rapid consolidation spreading throughout the entertainment industry, it looks like the WWE is well positioned, even if there are swerves ahead.
Our world is changing. Every day, it changes a little faster. Some changes are too small to see. Others, too big to handle. Sometimes, change feels slow. So slow, we don't even notice. Other times, it happens all at once, and we can't keep up. For our climate, change means many things. And between too small to see and too big to handle, there is a whole world of difference. The clock is ticking. This is Bloomberg Green.
Saving the seas. This week, the deep-sea diver who stopped writing the ocean's obituary to find a solution. Enric Sala tells us why the next 10 years matter most. And globalization needs to get greener. Shipping accounts for nearly an eighth of all transport emissions. How can the industry clean up its act? Plus, protecting coastlines comes at a huge environmental cost. But one Israeli startup found a way to keep the sea out and the animals in. From London, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. After more than a decade of studying the ocean as an academic, Enric Sala realized he was writing the ocean's obituary. He quit his job and became a full-time conservationist. As an in-house explorer for National Geographic, he's clocked more than 5,000 open water dives. He's also founded Pristine Seas, a project that combines exploration, research, and media to lobby countries to protect their oceans. To date, it has helped create marine reserves equivalent to half the size of Canada. I spoke to him about his mission and why it's so urgent.
The state of the world's oceans is really bad. We have lost 90% of the large fish in the ocean. Sharks, groupers, cod, tuna. More than half of the fish stocks are overfished, which means that we are taking them out of the water faster than they can reproduce. More than half of the ocean is affected by industrial fishing, and global warming is killing coral reefs all around the world. The ocean is in a trajectory of decline.
Can you just visualize for our viewers who never get to see the kind of things you are able to see, what an ocean and healthy ecosystem looks like versus one that's next to a bustling economic and industrialized area?
Coral reefs in the United States, in the Florida Keys, are down to only 2% of what they used to be. Before, 80 to 90% of the bottom on a coral reef in the Caribbean was covered by live coral. Now, Florida Keys have only 2%. The average in the Caribbean is about 5% of the bottom covered by live coral. The rest is covered by slime and seaweed. And most of the fish you can see are this big. And it is very, very rare that if you jump into any place in the Caribbean at random, you see a shark. It's very, very rare. Now, let's go to Millennium Atoll, for example. An atoll that is uninhabited and fished south of the equator in the Central Pacific, belongs to the Republic of Kiribati. 2009, we conducted the first underwater expedition to this island, and I still remember the first time. Jumped over the side of the boat, and as soon as the bubbles cleared, I was surrounded by 15 gray reef sharks. After a couple minutes, the sharks decided that we were boring, and they went back to do their thing. And you look down, 90% of the seafloor is covered by thriving coral, and it's full of fish, and a sea turtle comes by. Now, this abundance that we rarely see anywhere except in well-managed marine reserves. This is what the ocean used to be like, and this is what we have learned from going to these pristine places.
And you write in your book that you're writing the obituary of ocean life. What's the cure?
The cure is doing less harm. Basically, there are three things that we are doing to the ocean. One is we are taking fish out of the water faster than they can reproduce. Two, we are turning the ocean warmer and more acidic because of man-made climate change. And three, we are throwing in everything that we don't want, our waste and our plastic. We need basically to reverse these trends.
Does this mean that a lot of this falls to governments and their policies?
That's a big part of it, because it is governments that regulate fishing and mineral extraction and oil extraction. It is governments that have the legal authority to create large marine reserves in the ocean. But also, local communities have an important role to play because some of the most successful protected areas in the ocean are community-led and community-managed marine reserves. So when the fish come back, the divers come in. And that creates huge economic opportunities through ecotourism. These areas that are managed by communities are very successful because the communities have a vested interest in having as many fish as possible inside them so they can enjoy the benefits.
What from the pandemic has changed your view when it comes to protection of the environment?
Nature has given us a very strong signal of how fast it can recover if we just give it space. Everybody was fascinated by all these videos of the whales and the dolphins coming into marinas and mountain lions on the streets of Santiago in Chile, wild goats in the UK. Nature has this extraordinary ability to bounce back if we just give it space. This is why we need to protect at least 30% of the planet by 2030.
How do healthy marine ecosystems help in the fight against climate change, though?
Most people see the ocean as a victim of climate change, but the ocean can also be a solution because we know that the more life that is in the ocean, like big fish and big whales, the more these organisms help to make the ocean productive and absorb more CO2. The kelp forest, seagrass beds, all of these are important ecosystems in the ocean that are similar to the forests on the land that capture a lot of our carbon pollutions.
What are you most excited about in your field?
We have 10 years to fix this problem. Global fisheries catch is going down, stocks are collapsing. Business as usual means that by 2050, 90% of the coral reefs are gone, that most commercial fisheries have collapsed. That affects food security, that affects migration of people. We have 10 years to get to peak greenhouse gas emissions and then go carbon neutral by 2050. And we have 10 years to protect at least 30% of the ocean so we can restore much of this health and productivity, not just for saving biodiversity, but also saving our life support system. We are not talking about something that is apart from us. We are not apart from nature. We are a part of nature. So these 10 years are probably the most critical in the history of humanity.
The most accurate measurements of changing oceans will come from space. While Enric Sala explores what lies beneath, a new satellite is giving us data from above.
We'll learn more about our oceans and climate change, but from space. A new satellite's been launched from California. Its mission: track the accelerating rise of sea levels.
Well, the main instruments on board include a dual-frequency radar altimeter. And this is the primary instrument of the mission, and that's the one that's measuring sea surface height, significant wave height, and wind speed over the ocean. And from those measurements, we can actually have the superb measurements that we expect of sea level rise.
Data gathered from Sentinel-6 will be used alongside information from other satellites to build as complete a picture of the oceans as possible.
With a long record, we can precisely measure the acceleration. We eventually can detect new regime, tipping points. For example, if there is a runaway in the melting of Greenland or Antarctica, sea level will record this runaway change because it is an integrator of all changes that are occurring in the climate system. So we will be able to see some change, big change in the global climate.
The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration expects that sea level rise will increasingly threaten U.S. coastlines. One example, the southern tip of Manhattan is expected to flood 20 to 40 times a year by 2030.
11 of the 15 largest megacities are located at the coast, and this number will double. The number of people living in coastal area will double by 2060. So, knowing how much sea level is rising at the coast and how much it will rise in the future in coastal areas is as obvious. It's obviously a major goal for human beings.
Coming up, from sails to steam to oil, the shipping industry is no stranger to change. But how will it navigate the next transition? This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. This is Bloomberg Green. Now, for your roundup of this week's latest climate news, Jennifer Zabazaja has your Green in Brief.
Here's the climate news you need to know. Deforestation of the world's largest rainforest has hit a 12-year high. More than 4,000 square miles of the Amazon rainforest was destroyed in 2020. That's a 9.5% increase from a year earlier. Government data shows that destruction has soared since President Jair Bolsonaro took office and weakened environmental enforcement. The Amazon is home to millions of species and plants and is critical in the fight against climate change. Bitcoin is hitting all-time highs, but at what cost to the environment? The cryptocurrency is energy intensive, and there are concerns if it becomes mainstream. According to MIT, back in 2018, Bitcoin's carbon footprint was almost as big as Portugal's. Want to get better at tackling climate change? We'll hire more women. That's according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Firms with 30% or more women in top jobs tend to perform better when it comes to the environment and are more likely to set clear climate goals. Shopping online is more popular than ever now, but the price of convenience is measured in CO2, and more deliveries means more fuel burned and more packaging wasted. So what can companies do? Well, many are becoming more efficient and sourcing more clean energy for their data centers and warehouses. And England's farmers will be paid to go green after Brexit. As European subsidies are phased out, they'll get new money to encourage them to produce healthy, sustainable food. Poor farming practices are one of the leading drivers of water pollution and the loss of biodiversity. I'm Jennifer Zabazaja in New York. Anne-Marie, back to you.
The shipping industry is more than just the grease on the wheels of globalization. It's its chief enabler. 11 billion tons of goods are transported by ship each year, the biggest contributors being 2 billion tons of oil, 1 billion tons of iron ore, and 350 million tons of grain. According to the International Chamber of Shipping, 80% of Europe's imports and exports happen over the seas. And for such a vast industry, it also contributes its fair share of emissions. Shipping makes up 12% of global transport energy consumption. So how does it clean up its act? Earlier, I caught up with Bloomberg Green reporter Laura Milan about just how big of a challenge this is going to be for the industry.
One of the main issues is size. So about 90% of the world's cargo is moved by ships. So obviously changing such a huge industry is not going to be fast, and it's not going to be easy. The second issue has to do with technology. So ships obviously travel for many days at sea. It's not as easy for them to refuel as it would be for a car, for example, going on a road. And the sector still hasn't found a technology that's economically viable and that's zero emissions, and equivalent to the electric batteries for cars, for example.
But actions are being put in place to make the industry a bit more environmentally friendly. Walk us through those steps that they're taking.
That's it. So there's a first step that would involve using low emission fuels or biofuels that would significantly reduce the existing emissions. And then at a regulatory level, when it comes to the policy and the governments, there are steps being made as well. I would say that the most significant ones come from the European Union, which started to track emissions a few years ago and is now looking to include shipping emissions in the emissions trading system. So that would significantly reduce and help calculate the emissions from the shipping industry. Now, China is taking similar steps. So at the moment, regions need to report shipping emissions to the central government. And finally, we have the International Maritime Organization with a pledge to reduce shipping emissions by 50% in 2050. Now, we must say that that pledge has been considered insufficient by environmental groups, but at least some steps are being taken.
So to get to 2050, the industry obviously is going to need to start tapping some new technologies. What new technologies are you seeing being introduced into the shipping industry?
So we have seen pilot technologies being developed for years now, but what's interesting about this current moment is that we're seeing big players invest in these technologies that are not yet economically viable, but that one day might be. So for example, we are seeing earlier this year, the world's largest agricultural commodities trader, Cargill, saying they will invest in attaching sails to their ships so they can make any technology that they run their ships on more efficient. Similarly, we have seen a spin-off of Airbus, the aeronautics company, developing a similar application with kites. We have been following also developments in hydrogen. So at the moment, hydrogen fuel seems like a good option, a possible option when it has been developed and when it becomes economically viable. And we have Vestas, for example, the world's largest turbine maker, developing some ships that will be able to run on hydrogen in the near future.
Coming up, rising sea levels means humans need to get creative when it comes to coastal defenses. But how do we protect both ourselves and the environment? One Israeli startup may have the answer. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg Green. In London, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. This is Bloomberg Green. After water, what's the resource that humans use the most? It's concrete, 3 tons a year for every person on the planet. And engineers estimate it's used twice as much as all other building materials combined. And it comes with a huge environmental cost. Concrete, not just in cities, it's a common feature on our coastlines too. And that's taking a toll on biodiversity. But one Israeli startup has found a way of making sea defenses stronger and encouraging life to thrive.
If you take a look at concrete structures like breakwaters or seawalls, the water around them is often clear. That's not actually a good thing, because it means there's no life. Marine species are actually most abundant in coastal areas, but it's also where us humans prefer to live too. So when we build here, we drive away marine life.
The concrete in the marine world has a lot of additives, a lot of chemicals, and some of those materials are actually leaching out, and they're actually prohibiting marine life to thrive. If we keep developing without any regards to natural communities, there is a tilting point from which beyond we cannot really go back.
In the coastal city of Tel Aviv, an Israeli startup wants to revolutionize our urban coastlines. Their sea defenses are transforming lifeless man-made structures into teeming ecosystems. They do this by replacing standard concrete with their own special cement formulas.
As opposed to regular cement-based concrete, e-concrete includes certain elements that enhance the growth of marine flora and fauna of plants and animals. Our admix, which is kind of our secret sauce, is basically kind of sealing the concrete, making it less aggressive for the marine environment. That once we add it, we enable life to flourish.
In the lab, the team run tests to identify what mixes will work best for marine life.
So we take really ice cube sized concrete slabs of different compositions, and we put larvae, 20, 30, 50. We need to have a lot of replicates. We're geeky scientists, so we have to have a lot of replication and controls. And then within a few days or just a few weeks, we can get an answer on their preference. So obviously if they die, they have a very low tolerance to that specific concrete mix design. And if they thrive or they flourish, we can quantify that very quickly.
E-concrete says it typically sees double the biodiversity of regular grey concrete. From fish and sea caterpillars on their armour blocks to crabs on these tidal pools that sit on the shoreline.
This unit holds water during the low tide, so it's always moist, and therefore it has a very comfortable habitat for crabs and sea anemones and sea stars, etc. These pools have been here for less than 3 months, and this is already what you can see. It's covered with life. See the rock around it, which has been here for probably 10, 20, maybe even more years, only has a thin layer of green algae, and that's it.
As well as the composition of the cement mix, e-concrete designs its products specifically to the marine environment it will be deployed, to create niches for endangered species, or to develop nurseries like these oyster beds. The final part of the equation is creating complex surface textures to mimic natural rock or coral, an environment that helps anchor young organisms.
When concrete elements are being cast, the typical goal is to have a very slick surface, very, very smooth. The idea is to get the water to flow right across it. When we're designing e-concrete with a rough surface, we want to do the complete opposite. We want to slow the water when they are crossing the structure so that the larvae can actually adhere and attach to the surface.
E-concrete has to offer its clients more than just ecological credentials. Over time, they've discovered that creating hospitable habitats for marine life adds another advantage, one that is surely hard to ignore.
We've seen evidence to the fact that the growth of the organisms on the concrete create kind of a layer of defense. Just the addition of weight, we can actually gain stability and strength over time.
This is let's say the unit when we put it in the water. And this is after a year in the water. And what you can see here is all the oysters are completely covering it. We designed the units so they can withstand the forces and perform in terms of structural performance, but they can also be a backbone for ecological enhancement.
The company tests its miniature designs in tanks full of real seawater, rocks, plants, and animal life from around the world.
What we're looking for is the accumulation of calcium carbonate on the surface of the concrete of different mixes and different designs. This is the process that we call biogenic buildup. So with time, we get a buildup of calcium carbonate that is sourced from marine organisms on the surface of the concrete. And we actually encapsulate the concrete with a natural rock. So when the organism die, in the case of a coral, it will die, and then another coral will sit on it, and that's how a reef is growing.
The hope that our man-made structures could become stronger over time also means better economics. The units require less maintenance and could therefore stay in the water for longer. E-concrete, though, is just a few years old, so it needs more time to really quantify the longevity of its products. But the company are certain their products are better for the environment, and not just in terms of improving biodiversity.
We're kind of trying to offset some of that immense carbon footprint of the concrete industry.
Construction is responsible for about 11% of global carbon emissions. By adding a biological crust to their products, e-concrete prevents some CO2 from being released into the atmosphere.
For every kilogram of calcium carbonate being created by those marine organisms, we're offsetting 120 grams of CO2. So think about building a port infrastructure or a city waterfront that is an active carbon sink. I think that's a great advantage of the technology.
That does it for this week, but let's keep the conversation going on Twitter. Follow us at Climate. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio and from Tim's home in Brooklyn, streaming on YouTube. It is Wednesday, February 10th, 2020. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenovic. And not exactly a Fed Wednesday, but we're going to hear from the Fed chief in just a few minutes, Tim.
Right. Fed Chair Jerome Powell is going to start speaking in just a couple of minutes, and then he's going to do a Q&A when he's done speaking. So a lot of Fed Chair Powell today.
Yeah, and I think it's really timely considering there's so much debate about, do we spend too much in terms of stimulus? What does that mean for inflation? You know, what do we need to do to get the economy going? So we're going to take you there to the Economic Club of New York in just a moment. First up, though, let's set up the trading day for you. Here is Charlie Pellet.
The developing story. In fact, we've got some headlines from that speech. Fed Chair Jay Powell saying the U.S. is, quote, still very far from a strong labor market. Also says achieving full employment needs a society-wide commitment. Again, those headlines from Fed Chair Jay Powell. We'll have the speech for you coming up in a moment right here on Bloomberg Radio. Quick check of the markets for you right now. Looking at the S&P 500 index, lower by 3, little change, down 0.1%. Stocks on track for a second drop. We have got the Dow pushing higher by 36 points, up 0.1%. Could see a record close there. A down day for NASDAQ, retreating from a record, down 27, a drop there of 0.2%. 10-year up 6/32, 10-year yield right now 1.13%. Gold up 0.3%. 18 the ounce. Silver today is moving lower, down 1%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.4%, 58.61 a barrel. After the bell today, a lot of earnings among the companies we'll be hearing from. Uber, shares up now by 5.1%. Also reporting after the bell, Zillow down 1%, and Zynga, it is down 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week, and focus on the we're going to hear from Jay Powell in just a moment, brought to you by Commonwealth, supporting more than 2,000 independent financial advisors with the solutions they need to grow a thriving business. Commonwealth, go where you grow. Visit commonwealth.com to learn more. We've got quite a lineup that really looking forward to. We've got, of course, Jay Powell coming up. We've got the CEO of Mattel. We've got the former chairman of the FDIC, Sheila Bair. We're also going to hear from the head of Microsoft, Satya Nadella. But before that, Tim, we got to set everybody up with the trade.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Let's bring in the Bloomberg Business Week agenda. With us is Bloomberg Stocks editor Dave Wilson on the Access line in New Jersey. So, Dave, I feel like today is in some ways very similar to what we saw yesterday, and it just feels like everybody's taking a breather to see how things start to play out.
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, given the lack of direction that we're seeing in stocks, and you have to bear in mind we're past the halfway.
Keeping it, I have no doubt in my mind he would make it even harder for some of these Republicans who clearly have decided to, whatever it is, put their hands over their eyes and just make a political decision here. So, yeah, I think the president's silence here and not having access to Twitter is oddly a benefit. I do have a question for Andrew Lester, sure. and it's this. Where do you stop in making your case on intent when it comes to the former president? Because to me, there's a through line between his actions from the 2016 campaign that you investigated, his actions in Ukraine with Joe Biden in the 2020 campaign, and of course now. And I know that there's a point where it becomes redundant, but this perception that somehow there is this big lie. This big lie began in October, but it began in July of 2016. Former president. When does it become? To me, there's a through line. Would you keep going, I guess, if you were Jamie Raskin?
That's a great question, and I completely agree with you in terms of the big lie. But I think if I were Jamie Raskin, I would do what's happening here, which is keeping it relatively tight, because ultimately the charge here has to be tied to the violence in Congress.
Andrew and Chuck, I'm sorry to cut you off, but Congressman Raskin is back at the podium as the trial resumes.
Okay.
Mr. President, esteemed members of the Senate, it is my solemn honor to be before you today. I am Madeleine Dean, Congresswoman from the 4th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. I'm a lawyer. I'm a former professor of writing. I'm a sister. I'm a wife. I'm a mother. I'm a grandmother to 3 with 4th on her way. I'm a person of faith. And I'm an American. Along with Manager Liu, I will present the actions of a desperate president. And we will present evidence today of a class of public servants who, standing up to enormous pressure from the President of the United States, did the right thing and upheld their oaths. My colleagues just presented evidence of a President Trump's months-long efforts to incite his base, leading them to believe the election was stolen, that they needed to fight like hell to stop the steal on January the 6th. These weren't President Trump's only efforts to overturn the results. Manager Liu and I will present evidence of President Trump's relentless, escalating campaigns to fabricate an election victory by ignoring adverse court rulings, pressuring and threatening election officials, attacking senators and members of Congress, pressuring the Justice Department, and finally bullying his own vice president. President Trump and his allies filed 62 separate lawsuits in federal courts across more than half a dozen states and the District of Columbia, including Pennsylvania, my home state, as well as Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, and Wisconsin. Of the 62 post-election legal challenges, he lost 61. Only one was successful, and that case involved ballot curing in Pennsylvania and had no impact on President Biden's 80,555 vote victory in our Commonwealth. To be clear, not a single court, not a single judge agreed that the election results were invalid or should be invalidated. Instead, court after court reviewing these challenges said these cases were, quote, not credible, without merit, based on nothing but speculation, and flat out wrong. The judiciary resoundingly rejected Trump's fraud allegations and upheld the election results. But it was more than that. The courts said these cases were different. They were dangerous to our democracy. For an example, in an opinion by United States District Court Judge Matthew Brann from Pennsylvania, he said, and I quote, "This court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations. In the United States of America, this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of its sixth most populated state. Our people and laws and institutions demand more. Because this court has no authority to take away the right to vote of even a single person, let alone millions of citizens, it cannot grant plaintiffs' requested relief." That decision by Judge Braun was affirmed on appeal by Judge Stephanos Bibas, a Trump appointee who agreed and wrote, and I quote, "The campaign's claims have no merit. The number of ballots it specifically challenges is far smaller than the roughly 81,000 vote margin of victory. And it never claims fraud or that any of the votes were cast by illegal voters. Plus, tossing out millions of mail-in ballots would be drastic and unprecedented, disenfranchising a huge swath of the electorate and upsetting all down ballot races," end quote. Similarly, as Judge Linda Parker of the Eastern District of Michigan framed it, she said, "Stunning in its scope and breathtaking in its reach. If granted, the relief would disenfranchise the votes of more than 5.5 million Michigan citizens who, with dignity and hope and a promise of a vote, participated in the 2020 general election." Donald Trump told his supporters, "They are stealing the election. They took away your vote. It's rigged." That was not true. According to judge after judge, the truth was exactly the opposite. Trump was not suing to ensure election integrity. He was pursuing lawsuits that would, in effect, strip away American votes so that he could win. In other words, Donald Trump was asking the judiciary to take away votes from Americans so that he could steal the election for himself. Then, after losing in all the courts, Trump turned to another tactic, pressuring and threatening election officials. You saw what happened in Michigan after Trump attacked the state and its election officials. His supporters surrounded the Secretary of State's home, as you saw in the earlier slide, chanting, calling her a felon. On November 17th, the Board of Canvassers for Wayne County, Michigan, home to Detroit, unanimously certified the election results for Biden. That same night, after their vote to certify the results, Trump called the two Republican members of that board, pressuring them to change their minds. The call worked. The next day, both Monica Palmer and William Hartman, the Republican board members, attempted to rescind their vote to certify Michigan's election results, but they simply couldn't. President Trump didn't stop there. He then contacted Majority Leader of the Michigan Senate, Mike Shirkey, and the Speaker of the Michigan House, Lee Chatfield, to lobby them to overturn Michigan's results. Trump invited Mr. Chatfield and Mr. Shirkey to Washington to meet with him at the White House, where the president lobbied them further. Let's be clear. Donald Trump was calling officials, hosting them at the White House, urging them to defy the voters in their state and instead award votes to Trump. The officials held strong, and so Trump moved on to a different state, my home state of Pennsylvania. I am certain my senators, Casey and Senator Toomey, remember what happened there. In early December, as he did in Michigan, he began calling election officials, including my former colleagues in the Pennsylvania legislature, Republicans, Majority Leader Kim Ward and Speaker of the House, Brian Cutler. Majority Leader Ward said the president called her to, quote, declare there was a fraud in the voting, end quote. Then on November 25th, President Trump phoned into a Republican state Senate policy hearing trying to convince the Republican legislators, senators, and House members there had been a fraud in the vote. He even had his lawyer hold a phone up to the microphone in that hearing room so the committee could hear him. Here is what he said.
We can't let that happen. We can't let it happen for our country. And this election has to be turned around because we won Pennsylvania by a lot and we won all of these swing states by a lot.
This was a gathering. I've attended many, I have to tell you, as a former state legislator, a lot of policy hearings. I have to say with some confidence that was likely the first time a president of the United States of America called into a state legislative policy hearing. And remember, here is the president saying he won Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania had been certified that Biden had won by more than 80,000 votes. Less than a week after calling into that meeting, he invited multiple Republican members of the Pennsylvania legislature to the White House, the same scheme he had used on the Michigan legislators. It didn't work with those public servants either. Think about it. The President of the United States was calling public officials, calling from the White House, inviting them into the Oval Office, telling them to disenfranchise voters of their state, telling them to overturn the will of the American people. Also, he could take the election for himself. And then in Georgia, a state Trump had counted on for victory, his conduct was perhaps the most egregious. On November 11th, Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger confirmed that he believed ballots were accurately counted for Biden. Trump went on a relentless attack. Here are just a few examples. In all, Trump tweeted at Raffensperger 17 times in the coming week. I'll show you just a few. Calling him a disaster, obstinate, not having a clue, being played for a fool, and being a so-called Republican. All because Raffensperger was doing his job, ensuring the integrity of our elections. And these attacks had consequences. Mr. Raffensperger and his family received death threats. Quote, your husband deserves to face a firing squad. You better not botch this recount. Your life depends upon it. The Raffenspergers should be put on trial for treason and face execution. Just some of the threats they received. After these death threats, on November 25th, Mr. Raffensperger wrote an op-ed where he said, my family voted for Trump, donated to him, and are now being thrown under the bus by him. But he also noted, elections are the bedrock of our democracy. They need to be run fairly and perhaps more importantly, impartially. That's not partisan, that's just American. It's important to remember that this wasn't just a random attack. Trump wasn't just criticizing a politician over policy. We're saying he didn't agree. Donald Trump was savagely attacking a Secretary of State because the official did his job and certified the state according to how the people in that state voted. Donald Trump was trying to undermine our elections by taking votes away from the American people so that he could remain president. And he was willing to blame and betray anyone, even his own supporters, if they got in the way. Remember, senators, those threats were to Mr. Raffensperger's family. So some may say Trump didn't know his attacks against Mr. Raffensperger would result in death threats, except that all of this was very public. The secretary published his op-ed in USA Today, and major networks, including Fox, covered the threats against the Raffensperger. What did Trump do? Did he stop? Did he say, no, supporters, that isn't what I meant? No, he doubled down. Let's see the evidence.
This was a massive fraud. This should never take place in this country. We're like a third world country. Look at Georgia. But I understand the Secretary of State, who is really, he's an enemy of the people. The Secretary of State, and whether he's Republican or not, this man, what he's done.
Like this character in Georgia who's a disaster.
Let that sink in. A Republican public servant doing his job, whose family had just received death threats, and the President of the United States labeled him an enemy of the people. And that's why this is different, because this was not just one attack or one comment. This was attack after attack in the face of clear threats of violence. And on December 1st, another official, Gabriel Sterling, a Republican who voted for Trump, made this point and appealed directly to our president to stop his dangerous conduct.
Mr. President, it looks like you likely lost the state of Georgia. We're investigating. There's always a possibility. I get it. You have the rights to go through the courts. What you don't have the ability to do, and you need to step up and say this, is stop inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence. Someone's going to get hurt, someone's going to get shot, someone's going to get killed.
Mr. Sterling put this perfectly. In this country, we can appropriately challenge a close count, or go to the courts, or disagree with others, or make bold statements. But what Trump was doing was different. Someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed. Mr. Sterling saw what Trump's conduct was fomenting. He warned him on live TV that violence was already happening and that more violence was foreseeable and inevitable. Sterling's pleas were played over and over on every network. Rather than heed that warning, Trump escalated again. In early December, Trump called Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, and pressured him to hold a special session of the state legislature to overturn the election results and to appoint electors who would vote for Trump. A few weeks later, on December 23rd, Trump called the chief investigator for the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, who was conducting an audit of the signature matching procedures for absentee ballots. Trump urged him, find the fraud, and claimed the official would be a national hero if he did. Let's call this what it is. He was asking the official to say there was evidence of fraud when there wasn't any. The official refused, and the investigation was completed. And on December 29th, Raffensperger announced that the audit found, quote, no fraudulent absentee ballots with a 99% confidence level. On January 3rd, Trump tweeted about a call he had with a Georgia election official the day before. He said, and I quote, I spoke to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger yesterday about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under the table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. On January the 5th, the Washington Post released a recording of that call, which had occurred on January 2nd. Remember, just 4 days before the attack on the Capitol. Here is what President Trump said.
It's more illegal for you than it is for them, because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk.
Let's be clear. This is the President of the United States telling a Secretary of State that if he does not find votes, he will face criminal penalties. And not just any number of votes. Donald Trump was asking the Secretary of State to somehow find the exact number of votes Donald Trump lost the state by. Remember, President Biden won Georgia by 11,779 votes. In his own words, Trump said, "All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes." He wanted the Secretary of State to somehow find the precise number plus one so that he could win. Here's what he said.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
He says it right there. The President of the United States telling a public official to manufacture the exact votes needed so he can win. Senators, we must not become numb to this. Trump did this across state after state, so often, so loudly, so publicly. Public officials like you and me receive death threats and calls threatening criminal penalties, all because Trump wanted to remain in power. These public officials exercised great political and personal courage in the face of unprecedented pressure from a President of the United States. Senators, ours is a dialogue with history, a conversation with the past, with a hope for the future. Senators, I thank you today for your kind attention.
Good afternoon. I'm Congressman Ted Lieu. My colleague, Congresswoman Dean, went through President Trump's efforts to overturn the election through the courts, and when that started failing, his deeply disturbing attacks on state and local officials. I'm going to walk through President Trump's extraordinary efforts remaining until January 6th, when he tried again to overturn the election. I first want to highlight Representative Raskin's question to all of you today. Is this America? Like all of you, I love this country. I am an immigrant. My parents came to Ohio, and we started off living in the basement of a person's home. We were poor, and they went to flea markets to sell gifts to make ends meet. Over many years, they built a small business, opened 6 gift stores, and achieved the American dream. It's one reason I joined the United States Air Force on active duty. I believe America is an exceptional country. I was trained as a prosecutor at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, and I remain in the reserves because we're the greatest country in the world. But how did our exceptional country get to the point where a violent mob attacked our Capitol, murdering a police officer, assaulting over 140 other officers? How did we get to the point where rioters desecrated, defiled, and dishonored your Senate chamber, where the very place in which you sit became a crime scene, and where National Guard troops still patrol outside wearing body armor? I'll show you how we got here. President Donald J. Trump ran out of nonviolent options to maintain power. After his efforts in the courts and threatening officials failed, he turned to privately and publicly attacking members of his own party in the House and in the Senate. He would publicly bait senators, naming them in social media. For example, on December 18th, President Trump named at Senate Majority Leader and Republican senators, telling them they have to get tougher or they won't have a Republican Party anymore. We won the presidential election by a lot. Fight for it. Don't let them take it away. President Trump was suggesting to members of this Senate that if they didn't help him try to overturn the election, there would be consequences. On December 24th, President Trump wrote, I saved at least 8 Republican senators, including Mitch, from losing in the last rigged for president election. Now they almost all sit back and watch me fight against a crooked and vicious foe, the radical left Democrats. I will, and in all capital letters he wrote, never forget, exclamation point. President Trump was telling you that you owe him, that if you don't help him fight to overturn the results, he will never forget, and that there will be consequences. These are threats, just like the threats he made to state and local officials. And it continued. On December 29th, President Trump tweeted, can you imagine if the Republicans stole a presidential election from the Democrats? All hell would break out. Republican leadership only wants a path of least resistance. Our leaders, not me of course, are pathetic. They only know how to lose. P.S. I got many senators and congressmen and congresswomen elected. I do believe they forgot. President Trump targeted senators and members of Congress on social media, calling them pathetic for letting the election get, quote, stolen from them. On January 4th, 2 days before the attack, President Trump tweeted, the surrender caucus within the Republican Party will go down in infamy as weak and ineffective guardians of our nation, who are willing to accept the certification of fraudulent presidential numbers. Now he's mocking some Republican members as the surrender caucus, calling them weak and ineffective guardians of our nation because they would not pretend that he had won when in fact he had not. And then the very day before the attack, President Trump's threats grew even more heated and specific towards Republicans that he considered to be part of that surrender caucus. Now, we've shown you this tweet before, but I want to draw your attention to how the president was not just inciting his base, but how he was also calling out specific Senate Republicans at the end of this tweet. This is a specific warning to anyone who won't help him overturn the results. Anyone who was against the president became an enemy. And let me be very clear. The president wasn't just coming for 1 or 2 people or Democrats like me. He was coming for you, for Democratic and Republican senators. He was coming for all of us, just as the mob did at his direction. In addition to going after senators and members of Congress, President Trump also pressured our Justice Department to investigate the false claims that the election was stolen. At the president's direction, Attorney General William Barr, a loyal member of the president's cabinet, authorized federal prosecutors to pursue substantial allegations of voting and vote tabulation irregularities. Bill Barr pursuing these allegations sparked an outcry. 16 assistant U.S. attorneys in the Trump administration urged the Attorney General to cease investigations because they had not seen evidence of any substantial anomalies. That means they did not find any evidence of real fraud. Attorney General Barr pursued the investigations anyways, and after his investigation, this is what he found, quote, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. 2 weeks later, on December 14th, the electors voted to give Joe Biden 306 electoral votes and ensured his victory. The following day, Bill Barr resigned. Attorney General Barr had loyally served President Trump. He had never publicly come out against the president, but for Bill Barr, making up election fraud claims and saying the election was stolen was a bridge too far. Bill Barr made clear that attempting to overturn election results crossed a line. According to a news report, Bill Barr, the highest law enforcement official in the land, told President Donald Trump to his face, that his theories of election fraud were, quote, bullshit, unquote. When Bill Barr resigned, his former deputy, Jeff Rosen, took his place. President Trump initially tweeted about Mr. Rosen that he was an outstanding person when he announced that he would become acting Attorney General. But when Rosen took over, President Trump put the same pressure on him that he had done with state officials, members of Congress, U.S. senators, and his former Attorney General. President Trump reportedly summoned acting Attorney General Rosen to the Oval Office the next day and pressured Rosen to appoint special counsels to keep investigating their election, including unfounded accusations of widespread voter fraud, and also to investigate Dominion, the voting machines firm. According to reports, Mr. Rosen refused. He maintained that he would make decisions based on the facts and the law, and reminded President Trump what he had already been told by Attorney General Bill Barr, that the department had already investigated and, quote, found no evidence of widespread fraud. But President Trump refused to follow the facts and the law, so the president turned to someone he knew would do his bidding. He turned to Jeffrey Clark, another Justice Department lawyer, who had allegedly expressed support for using the Department of Justice to investigate the election results. Shortly after acting Attorney General Rosen followed his duty and the law to refuse to reopen investigations, President Trump intended to replace Mr. Rosen with Mr. Clark, who could then try to stop Congress from certifying the Electoral College results. According to reports, White House counsel Pat Cipollone advised President Trump not to fire acting Attorney General Rosen. Department officials had also threatened to resign en masse if he had fired Rosen. President Trump's actions, time and time again, made clear that he would do anything and pressure anyone if it meant overturning the election results. We watched President Trump use any means necessary to pursue this aim, feverishly grasping for straws at retaining his hold on the presidency. But all his efforts prior to January 6th kept failing. And finally, in his desperation, he turned on his own vice president. He pressured Mike Pence to violate his constitutional oath and to refuse to certify the oath. President Trump had decided that Vice President Pence, who presided over the certification, could somehow stop it. As Pence would later confirm, the Vice President does not have that power in the Constitution. And President Trump never tried to explain why he thought the Vice President could block the certification of election results. He just began relentlessly attacking the Vice President. Publicly, President Trump attacked Pence on social media and at rallies, getting his supporters to believe that Mike Pence could stop this certification on January 6th. Here's what President Trump said in Georgia on January 4th.
And I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Behind closed doors, President Trump applied significant pressure to his second in command. Multiple reports confirmed that President Trump used his personal attorneys and other officials to pressure the vice president. Trump reportedly told almost anyone who called him to also call the vice president. According to reports, when Mike Pence was in the Oval Office, President Trump would call people to try to get them to convince the vice president to help him. And President Trump kept repeating the myth that Pence could stop the certification to his base to anger them, hoping to intimidate Mike Pence. On the morning of the rally on January 6th, President Trump tweeted, "All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states," and in all caps he wrote, "and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage." President Trump later went on to attack Pence nearly a dozen times in his speech at the Save America March. Privately, in person, before Pence headed to oversee the joint session on January 6th, President Trump again threatened Pence. "You can either go down in history as a patriot," Mr. Trump told him, according to two people briefed on the conversation, "or you can go down in history as a pussy." As a veteran, I find it deeply dishonorable that our former president and commander-in-chief equated patriotism with violating the Constitution and overturning the election. You will see and hear the consequences of President Trump's repeated attacks on the vice president, the chance of traitor, and the chance of hanging Mike Pence. Thankfully, Vice President Pence stood his ground like our other brave officials stood their ground. He refused the president and fulfilled his duty on January 6th, even after the Capitol was attacked, even after he was personally targeted, even after his family was targeted. Vice President Pence stood strong and certified the election. Vice President Pence showed us what it means to be an American, what it means to show courage. He put his country, his oath, his values, and his morals above the will of one man. The president had tried everything in his power to seize everything in his attempt to seize power from the rightful victor of the election. President Trump's extraordinary actions grew increasingly more desperate. You saw him go from pursuing claims in the courts to threatening state and local election officials, to then attacking members of Congress and the Senate, to compromising our Justice Department, and then to attacking the Republican vice president. These brave public servants were being pressured by our commander-in-chief to overturn the results. Some of them and their families got death threats. Thankfully, at every turn, our democratic processes prevailed and the rule of law prevailed. It was only because all of these people stayed strong and refused President Trump that our republic held fast and the will of the electorate was seen through. And at this point, President Donald J. Trump ran out of nonviolent options to maintain power. I began today by raising the question of how we got here. What you saw was a man so desperate to cling to power that he tried everything he could to keep it. And when he ran out of nonviolent measures, he turned to the violent mob that attacked your Senate chamber on January 6th. As you cast your vote after this trial, I hope each of you will think of the bravery of all these people who said no to President Trump because they knew that this was not right, that this was not America.
Next, Representative Stacey Plaskett of the Virgin Islands will show in quite chilling detail, I should say, how President Trump was well aware of the threat of violence on January 6th and how he welcomed and amplified his supporters' plans for insurrection against the Union. I should say, as lead manager, this is a moment of special pride for me because Representative Plaskett is not only the first delegate ever to be on a team of impeachment managers in American history, but she was also my law student at American University's Washington College of Law. And I hope I'm not violating any federal educational records laws when I say she was an A student then and she's an A+ student now. Stacey Plaskett.
Thank you so much. Height. Mr. President, distinguished senators, I'm Stacey Plaskett, and I represent the people of the Virgin Islands of the United States. Over this past weekend, my 11-year-old daughter, I overheard her telling one of my sons, "Mommy doesn't seem really nervous about the impeachment trial." To which that son, sounding like an older brother, said, Talia, you'll learn that most of the time, mommy really seems to have it under control. Now, we know as parents, that's not always the case. But I've learned throughout my life that preparation and truth can carry you far, can allow you to speak truth to power. I've learned that as a young Black girl growing up in the projects in Brooklyn, housing community on St. Croix, sent to the most unlikeliest of settings, and now as an adult woman representing an island territory speaking to the U.S. Senate. And because of truth, I am confident today speaking before you, because truth and facts are overwhelming that our president, the President of the United States, incited a mob to storm the Capitol to attempt to stop the certification of a presidential election. My fellow managers have shown and will continue to show clear evidence that President Trump incited a violent mob to storm our Capitol when he ran out of nonviolent means to stop the election. Once assembled, that mob, at the president's direction, erupted into the bloodiest attack on this Capitol since 1814. Some of you have said there's no way the president could have known how violent the mob would be. That is false, because the violence, it was foreseeable. I want to show you why this violence was foreseeable and why Donald Trump was different than any other politician just telling their fighters, their supporters, to fight for something. The violence that occurred on January 6th, like the attack itself, did not just appear. You'll see that Donald Trump knew the people he was inciting. He saw the violence that they were capable of, and he had a pattern and practice of praising and encouraging that violence, never, ever condemning it. And you'll see that this violent attack was not planned in secret. The insurgents believed that they were doing the duty of their president. They were following his orders. And so they publicized it openly, loudly, proudly, exact blueprints of how the attack would be made. Law enforcement saw these postings and reported that these insurgents would violently attack the Capitol itself. This was not just a comment by an official to fight for a cause. This was months of cultivating a base of people who were violent, praising that violence, and then leading that violence, that rage, straight at our door. The point is this: by the time he called the cavalry of his thousands of supporters on January 6th, and an event he had invited them to, he had every reason to know that they were armed, that they were violent, and that they would actually fight. He knew who he was calling and the violence they were capable of. And he still gave that marching orders to go to the Capitol and, quote, fight like hell and stop the steal. Make no mistake, the violence was not just foreseeable to President Trump. The violence was what he deliberately encouraged. As early as September, Trump set the precedent that when asked to denounce violence, he would do the opposite and encourage it. Now, if the president had only said something once about fighting to stop the steal and violence erupted, there would be no way to know he intended to incite it or saw it coming. But just as the president spent months spreading his big lie of the election, he also spent months cultivating groups of people who, following his command, repeatedly engaged in real, dangerous violence. And when they did, when the violence erupted as a response to his calls to fight against the stolen election, he did not walk it back. He did not tell them no. He did the opposite. The opposite. He praised and encouraged the violence so that it would continue. He fanned the flame of violence, and it worked. You'll see this over time. These very groups and individuals whose violence the president praised helped lead the attack on January 6th. And that's how we know clearly that President Trump deliberately incited this, and how we know he saw it coming. There are many examples where the president engaged in this pattern, and I'm just going to walk you through a few of them. Let's start with the President Trump's incitement of the Proud Boys. Many of you have heard of this group, which since 2018 has been classified by the FBI as an extremist organization. Since that classification, the group has repeatedly engaged in serious acts of violence, including at pro-Trump rallies. In one such act, on September 7th, the Proud Boys attacked a man with a baseball bat and then punched him while he was down on the ground. On September 29th, during a presidential debate, President Trump was asked specifically if he was willing to condemn white supremacy and militia groups, if he was willing to tell them to stand down and stop the violence. Let's watch.
But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
willing to do
specifically
that, but
do it? Well,
I
go
would
ahead,
say,
sir.
Let's hear now the president's response.
Do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. You want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
White
name.
supremacists
Who
and
would
right
you like me to condemn?
white
Proud Boys.
supremacists and right
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
When asked to condemn the Proud Boys and white supremacists, what did our president say? He said, stand back and stand by. His message was heard loud and clear. The group adopted that phrase, stand back and stand by, as their official slogan. They created merchandise with their new slogan, which they wore proudly across their backs at Trump's rallies, and they followed the president's orders. You'll see more about this later in the trial, but you'll see in these photos, to the left, Dominic Pizzola, and to the right, William Pepe, two of the leaders of the group, heading to the Capitol on January 6th. They were later charged with working together to obstruct law enforcement. As we go through this evidence, I want you to keep in mind these words by President Trump when asked to condemn violence. Stand back and stand by. And see example after example of the kinds of people like the Proud Boys who he had standing by on January 6th. By October, as my colleagues Mr. Castro and Mr. Swalwell showed you, Donald Trump was escalating his big lie that the only way he could lose the election was if it was rigged. So, as election day neared, his supporters were frustrated and they were angry. They were prepared to ensure his victory by any means necessary. One of these violent acts was on October 30th. Sometime after 12:30 p.m., a caravan of more than 50 trucks covered in pro-Trump campaign gear confronted and surrounded cars carrying Biden-Harris campaign workers and a Biden-Harris campaign bus as they were traveling down Interstate 35 from San Antonio to Austin. According to witnesses, this caravan repeatedly tried to force the bus you saw and you see in that video to slow down in the middle of the highway and then to run it off the road. What that video you just saw does not show is that the bus that they tried to run off the road was filled with young campaign staff, volunteers, supporters, surrogates, people. As the Trump supporters closed in on the bus, a large black pickup truck adorned with Trump flags suddenly and intentionally swerved and crashed into a car driven by a Biden-Harris volunteer. News of the event went viral on social media. The President of the United States, in a campaign, saw his own supporters trying to run a bus carrying his opponent's campaign workers off the highway to physically intimidate people in this country campaigning. Here was his response the next day. The President of the United States tweeted a video of his supporters trying to drive a bus off the road. You'll recall in that first video that I showed you, there was no sound. Well, the one that he tweeted had a fight theme song placed to it that the president put that music to that video. And he added at the top, "I love Texas." By the next evening, that tweet that he did had been viewed 12.6 million times. And it wasn't just a tweet. On November 1st, at a Michigan rally with a sea of supporters, the president talked about that incident again. Here it is.
Something. Do you see the way our people, they were protecting his bus yesterday because they're nice. So his bus, they had hundreds of cars. Trump, and the American flag. That's it. You see Trump and American flag.
The president made a public joke of violence against campaigners in an American election. He made light of it. This was not a joke. In fact, it was so violent, it put so many people in harm's way that the FBI investigated the incident and the criminal responsibility of those who attacked these campaign workers. Now, our President Donald Trump could have said, okay, I didn't realize how bad that was. This was very violent. Please stop. But he didn't. He saw the investigation and made a statement in defense of his supporters' attack on the bus, writing, quote, "In my opinion, these patriots did nothing wrong. Engaging in violence for him made them patriots to Donald Trump. For anyone who says Donald Trump didn't know the violence he was inciting, I ask you to consider his supporters tried to drive a bus off the highway in the middle of the day to intimidate his opponent's campaign workers. And his response was to tweet the video of the incident that had fight music, joke about it, and call those individuals in that incident patriots." And once again, Donald Trump's praise worked to incite them further. Emboldened by that praise, they remained ready to fight, ready to stand back and stand by. This link is not hypothetical. Just like we saw with the Proud Boys showing up in full force on January 6th, Donald Trump's encouragement of this attack made sure his supporters were ready for the next one. The caravan bus attack had been organized by a Trump supporter named Keith Lee. Leading up to the attack on our Capitol of January 6th, Mr. Lee teamed up with other supporters to fundraise to help to bring people to Washington, D.C. for that day. The morning of the attack, he filmed footage of the Capitol, pointed out the flimsiness of fencing, and then addressed his supporters before the attack saying, quote, "As soon as you all get done hearing the president, y'all get to the Capitol. We need to surround this place." During the attack, he used a bullhorn to call out for the mob to rush in. He later went to the rotunda himself and then back outside to urge the crowd to come inside. These are the people that President Trump cultivated, who were standing by. I'd like to look at another example. After the election on December 12th, Trump supporters gathered en masse to protest the stolen election in D.C. It was billed by his loyalists as the 2nd Million MAGA March. The rally was organized by Women for America First. The same group that you'll see later secured the permit for the January 6th rally. And who else was there? The Proud Boys, standing by. Donald Trump did not attend that rally, but he made sure to make clear his supporters throughout the day how he felt about the event. At 8:47 a.m., he sent out a tweet. "We have just begun to fight." And then the rally began. And Donald Trump's allies, who spoke at the rally, carried on his message of the stolen election and the importance of fighting to stop the steal. Here's Nicholas Fuentes, a commentator who had organized a Stop the Steal rally in Michigan with Trump supporters.
In the first Million MAGA March, we promised that if the GOP would not do everything in their power to keep Trump in office, then we would destroy the GOP. And as we gather here in Washington, D.C. for a 2nd Million MAGA March, we're done making promises. It has to happen now. We are going to destroy the GOP.
Let's go! Destroy the GOP! Destroy the GOP! Destroy the GOP!
Those words, that was Trump's message. Destroy anyone who won't listen, who won't help them take the election for Trump. And as you will see, this was just the preview for Fuentes, who, like the Proud Boys and the Trump caravan organizers, would later heed the president's call and come to Washington and be there on January 6th. Later in the rally, a former Trump campaign spokeswoman, Katrina Pearson, also spoke. During her speech, she stated, quote, "This isn't over. This is just beginning," referring to the fight to stop the steal. And then she added, "We knew both Republican and Democrats were against we the people. We are the cavalry. No one's coming for us." It's clear that Trump and some of his supporters saw this as war, a fight against anyone who was unwilling to do whatever it took to keep Donald Trump in power. We are the cavalry. And President Trump continued to reinforce his support of these messages throughout the day. At 1:48 p.m., after both speeches, he retweeted his deputy chief of staff's tweet showing his crowd that he had flown over on Marine One, and he tweeted, quote, "Thank you, patriots." These people were, as you can see, gathered en masse and being told by the president's allies that their election had been stolen. And they were told they were the cavalry. No one else could do it. And after hearing these speeches and seeing the president's support, this is what Donald Trump's cavalry was capable of. What you just saw was the violence that ensued after that rally. The Proud Boys, after that rally, engaged in serious acts of violence in downtown DC. Some Trump supporters and self-identified Proud Boys vandalized churches after that rally. If we look at these events, it's clear how we got here. Because what did the president do after that? He turned right around, and a little over a week later, he began coordinating the January 6th Save America rally with the same people who had planned the 2nd Million MAGA March. You'll recall that the Women for America First had organized that 2nd Million MAGA March. They had originally planned rallies for January 22nd and January 23rd, after the inauguration. But Donald Trump had other plans. On December 19th, President Trump tweeted his save the date for January 6th. He told his supporters to come to DC for a big protest, the day billing it as wild. Just days later, Women for America First amended their permit to hold their rally on January 6th, pursuant to the president's save the date, instead of after the inauguration. This was deliberate. Reports confirm that the president himself, President Trump, became directly involved with the planning of the event, including the speaking lineup, even the music to be played, just as he chose the music for his retreat of the caravan driving the Biden-Harris bus off the road with that fight song. And he brought the same people who spoke at the 2nd Million MAGA rally to help as well. Trump's campaign advisor, Katrina Pearson, who you recall said on December 12th that this is only the beginning, we are the cavalry, also became directly involved in planning the event. They even sent out invitations together. This is Amy Kremer, one of the founders of Women for America First, tweeting the invitation, tagging Donald Trump and other organizers, inviting the same supporters who had just engaged in serious violence at the 2nd Million MAGA rally to show up to the largest rally to stop the steal. And President Trump seemed to have other plans for what was going to happen at that rally, too. Women for America First had initially planned for the rally-goers to remain at the ellipse until the counting of the state electoral slates was completed, just like they had remained at Freedom Plaza after the 2nd Million MAGA March. In fact, the permit stated in no uncertain terms that the march from the ellipse was not permitted. It was not until after President Trump and his team became involved in the planning that the march from the ellipse to the Capitol came about, in direct contravention of the original permit. This was not a coincidence. None of this was. Donald Trump, over many months, cultivated violence, praised it, and then when he saw the violence his supporters were capable of, he channeled it to his big, wild, historic event. He organized January 6th with the same people that had just organized a rally, resulting in substantial violence, and made absolutely sure this time these violent rally-goers wouldn't just remain in place. He made sure that those violent people would literally march right here to our steps, from the ellipse to the Capitol, to stop the steal. His cavalry. This was deliberate. And because the President of the United States incited this, because he was orchestrating this, because he was inviting them, the insurgents were not shy about their planning. They believed they were following the orders of the commander-in-chief. They were, as the tweet we just saw, quite literally his cavalry. So they posted exact blueprints of the attack openly, loudly, proudly. And they did this all over public forums. These were not just hidden posts in dark websites that Trump would not have seen, quite the opposite. We know that President Trump's team monitored these websites. We know this because his advisors confirm it. An ex-White House and campaign insider, as you'll read, who has known both Scavino and the president for years, said there was no way that Scavino and the Trump social media operation would not have been aware of the plan circulating online to storm the Capitol. Because, and I quote, the Trump operation closely monitored the web's darkest corners, ranging from mainstream sites such as Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit, to fringe message boards like 4chan and XChan, now called XCun, to the Donald.win, an offshoot of a banned Reddit community dedicated to rabidly supporting all things Trump. They actively monitored the exact sites, like the Donald.win, on which these insurrectionists wrote their posts. And so what would Trump and his team have seen when they were monitoring these white sites? What would his supporters have said? They would have seen a clear roadmap of exactly what happened. This is an example of a post that was captured from one of the sites dedicated to Donald Trump that we just talked about, shortly before the site was taken down. And the meme reads, quote, "The Capitol is our goal. Everything else is a distraction. Every corrupt member of Congress locked in one room and surrounded by real Americans is an opportunity that will never present itself again." Let that sink in. Think about that. The exact thing that happened on January 6th, that was their goal. And they said it out loud on sites that the Trump administration was actively monitoring. A third-party site captured a post on the Donald.win where one user posted, quote, "This cannot simply be a protest. It has to be the establishment of the MAGA militia with the command offices set up, with all further militia tactical missions spreading from there." Another user said in response, quote, "We will have to achieve an actual tactical victory, like storming and occupying the Capitol, to have the intended effect." That's what they understood Donald Trump to want. There it is in black and white. And they explained why they felt justified in this. Another poster on the forum, the Donald.win, wrote on January 4th, quote, "If Congress illegally certifies Biden, Trump would have absolutely no choice but to demand us to storm Congress and kill/beat them up. Donald Trump will have no choice." That was what he made them believe, to the point his supporters felt justified even in carrying weapons and storming our Capitol. This was in post after post. Here's another. When discussing how to carry guns into D.C., one noted, quote, "Yes, it's illegal, but this is war, and we are clearly in a post-legal phase of our society." What? They treated it as a war, and they meant it. The morning of the attack, under the thread, "Today I told my kids goodbye," one poster wrote, "Today I had the very difficult conversation with my children that Daddy might not come home from D.C. Within a matter of hours, that post amassed 4,000 likes. President Trump had truly made them believe that their election had been stolen and that it was their patriotic duty to fight to steal it back. Patriotic. a term he gave those who use violence for him, and they were willing to say goodbye to their children for this fight. And their supporters didn't just rely on entering the Capitol with guns haphazardly. They had maps of this building. They talked through which tunnels to use and how to get to the Senate chamber. Some posted specific floor plans, layouts of the Capitol, alongside hopes of overwhelming law enforcement to, quote, find the tunnels, arrest the worst traitors. Posters also fixated on what they saw as their ability to easily overwhelm the Capitol Police, as, quote, there are only around 2,000 of them. And again, they urge, quote, the Capitol is our goal. Everything else is a distraction. There were hundreds of these posts, hundreds, monitored by the Trump administration. And these posts, they were chillingly accurate, right down to communication devices. A new affidavit filed by the FBI described preparations by the right-wing group, the Proud Boys, to storm the Capitol, including using earpieces and walkie-talkies to direct movements throughout the building. This happened. That's the level of planning in advance that occurred. They had earpieces. On the slide, you'll see Proud Boy member Dominic Pizzola has an earpiece in his right ear, consistent with the affidavit. And in addition to these detailed posts, they made clear why they thought they should do this, why they thought they could do this. It wasn't just that they were doing it to following the president's orders. They thought he would help them. A third-party site captured a post on the Donald.win again, the site monitored by Trump's team, and he wrote, quote, he, meaning Donald Trump in this instance, can order the Nat Guard to stand down if needed. Unfortunately, he has no control over the Capitol Police, but there are only around 2,000 of them, and a lot are useless fat asses or girls. It's all right there. The overall goal, maps of the Capitol, the weapons, communication devices. They even said publicly, openly, proudly, that President Trump will help them to commandeer the National Guard, so all they have to do is overwhelm the 2,000 Capitol Police officers. This was reported in the NBC News and the Washington Post with headlines like, violent threats ripple through far-right internet forums ahead of protests. Pro-Trump forums erupt with violent threats ahead of Wednesday's rally against the 2020 election. Fox News also reported that the Proud Boys would come to the January 6th rally prepared for violent action, even quoting a Proud Boy member who said they would, quote, incognito and spread across downtown DC in smaller numbers. City officials, seeing these same warnings, also publicly warned about the violence and unlawful weapons at the event. DC Mayor Muriel Bowser cautioned residents of the District of Columbia to avoid the downtown area while the rally attendees were in town. Federal law enforcement warned of these threats also. On January 3rd, a Capitol Police intelligence report warned of a violent scenario in which Congress itself could be the target of the angry supporters of President Trump on January 6th. According to that report, obtained by the Washington Post, supporters of the current president see January 6, 2021 as the last opportunity to overturn the results of the presidential election. This sense of desperation and disappointment may lead to more incentive to become violent. Unlike previous post-election protests, the targets of the pro-Trump supporters are not necessarily the counter-protesters as they were previously, but rather Congress itself is the target for January 6. The day before the rioters stormed the Congress, an FBI office in Virginia also issued an explicit warning that extremists were preparing to travel to Washington to commit violence and, quote, war, according to internal reports. The FBI report cited to an online post where the user declared that Trump supporters should go to Washington and get violent. The supporter said, quote, "Stop calling this a march or a rally or a protest. Go there ready for war. We get our president or we die." These threat warnings were not just hypothetical. Actual arrests occurred in the days leading to the attack. On January 4th, 2 days before the rally, one extremely well-publicized arrest was of a Proud Boy leader who destroyed a church's Black Lives Matter banner a month earlier during the December 12th Second Million MAGA March. Report emphasized that when he was arrested, he was carrying high-capacity firearm magazines, which he claimed were meant to be supplied to another rally attendee for January 6th. By the night of January 6th attack, DC police had already made 6 arrests in connection with the planned protests on charges of carrying weapons, ammunitions, assaulting police. This is all in public view, all of it. The truth is usually seen and rarely heard. Truth is truth, whether denied or not. And the truth is, President Trump had spent months calling his supporters to a march on a specific day, at a specific time, in specific places to stop the certification. And leading up to the event, there were hundreds of posts online showing that his supporters took this as a call to arms to attack the Capitol. There were detailed posts of plans to attack online. Law enforcement warned that these posts were real threats and even made arrests days leading up to the attack. And yet, in the face of all this, these credible warnings of serious, dangerous threats to our Capitol, when those thousands of people were standing in front of President Trump, ready to take orders and attack, this is what he said: "We're going to the Capitol, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." And that's why this is different. And that's why he must be convicted and disqualified.
Representative Dean will now return to the events of January 6th itself. She will demonstrate President Trump's repeated incitement of the crowd that morning as he directed them to the Capitol in his last-ditch effort to retain his hold on power.
For me and for many Americans, January 6th is forever etched in our memories. I went to work with a sense of excitement, the start of my second term in Congress and the first time I would participate in the certification of a presidential election. And then we all know what happened. I know many of us have similar experiences from that day, but I'll briefly share mine. I stood with colleagues in the gallery above the House floor to observe the Arizona challenge. Moments later, police radios reported a breach of the Capitol grounds. Someone shouted up to us, "Duck, then lie down, then ready your gas masks." Shortly after, there was a terrifying banging on the chamber doors. I will never forget that sound. Shouts and panicked calls to my husband and to my sons, instructions to flee, and then the constant whirring of the gas masks filtering the air. The chamber of the United States House of Representatives turned to chaos. For Donald Trump, it was a very different day. Earlier, I showed you Donald Trump's desperate attempts to maintain power, ignoring adverse court rulings, attacking elected officials, pressuring his Justice Department, even attacking his own vice president. You saw a man who refused to lose, who was desperate to retain power by any means necessary. You saw a man willing to attack anyone and everyone who got in his way. And you saw a man who thought he could play by different rules. He told his supporters, as my colleague Ms. Plaskett just showed you, exactly what he thought those different rules were. Combat, fight, violence. This was not just one speech. This was weeks and weeks of deliberate effort by Donald Trump to overturn the election results so that he didn't have to give up the presidency. The speech on January 6th builds on, refers to, and amplifies that same pattern, the pattern Trump had used and broadcasted for months. He refused to lose, his attacks on others, and his different rules. The only thing different about his speech on January 6th from all these other times that we went through was that he was no longer telling his base just that they had to fight to stop the steal. He was finally telling them, now is the time to do it. Here's the place, and here's how. For weeks, he urged his supporters to show up at a specific time and place, and when they got there, he told them exactly what he wanted. Let's start with his desperation. You saw how much planning went into January the 6th, and when the day arrived, Donald Trump's desperation was in full force. Between the time he woke up on January the 5th and the start of the Save America March, that next day, he had tweeted 34 times. When Donald Trump wants to get his message across, he is not shy, as you all know. These tweets were relentless, and these tweets all centered on his singular focus, his drumbeat to motivate, anger, and incite his supporters, his big lie. The presidential election had been rigged, it had been stolen from him, and they had to fight to stop it. And the timing was no coincidence. He sent 34 tweets because this was his last chance to rile up his supporters before the big, historic, wild event he had planned. Now, I won't go through all of these tweets, but let me just highlight a few. At 1 in the morning, he tweeted, "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Mike can send it back." This will look familiar to you because Mr. Liu just showed you how Trump had he was pressuring and publicly attacking his vice president to stop the certification. And when Vice President Pence refused, when he explained that the Constitution simply does not allow him to stop certification, Donald Trump provoked his base to attack him. The late in the evening tweet was no different. It just got more forceful. Let's be clear, what Donald Trump was saying, that Vice President Pence could send back the certification, was not true. For one thing, all 50 states had ratified this election. And for another, Vice President Pence explained to him that he does not have the power to unilaterally overturn states' votes and just send the certification back. And Donald Trump knew this, but this was his last chance to get his vice president to stop the certification, and so he was willing to say or do just about anything. These tweets attacking the election as fraudulent, attacking his vice president, and urging his supporters to fight continued throughout the morning. Here's another example. At 8:17 a.m., he tweeted, "All Mike Pence has to do is send it back to them and back to the states, and we win." And we win. That's what he said, even though by then he had clearly lost. As Trump continued tweeting, the Save America March at the White House was now in full swing. The speakers who warmed up the crowd for Trump were members of his inner circle, family members, his personal attorney, people President Trump had deputized to speak on his behalf. Some of the speakers also spoke at the second Million MAGA March, which resulted in serious violence. The warm-up acts on January 6th focused on promoting Donald Trump's big lie. They stoked the same fears: a stolen election, of fraud, of ripping victory away from them. And the speakers told them what to do about it. As the crowd erupted in "Fight for Trump," chants throughout that morning, Donald Trump Jr. urged, "That's the message. These guys better fight for Trump." The speakers lasted 3 hours, repeating President Trump's message, and finally, at about noon, Donald Trump took the stage with the seal of the presidency on his podium and the White House as his backdrop. President Trump spoke for more than 70 minutes. His narrative was familiar. It was the same message he had spent months spreading to his supporters. The big lie: the election was stolen, that they should never concede, and that his supporters should be patriots and fight much harder to stop the steal, to take back our country. The same phrases he'd spread for weeks, but now the message was immediate. Now it was just no longer just fight, it was fight right now.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about. And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal.
That set the tone. Our country has had enough and we will not take it anymore. He told them and us right at the beginning that the only way to take back the country was to fight. Let's look at what he said next.
And Rudy, you did a great job. He's got guts. You know what? He's got guts, unlike a lot of people in the Republican Party. He's got guts. He fights.
Ms. Plaskett showed you example after example of Donald Trump, when confronted with violence, praising it. We saw him instruct the Proud Boys, a violent extremist group, to stand back and stand by. That group was there on January the 6th. We saw him praise a caravan of his supporters after they tried to drive a bus belonging to the Biden campaign off the road. The organizer of that attack was there on January the 6th. And we saw him team up with the organizers of the violent second MAGA Million March to plan his rally on January the 6th. And what does he do at that rally? He tells Giuliani he's doing a great job addressing the crowd, saying he has guts to call for fighting. And to be clear, this is what he was praising.
So, let's have trial by combat.
Trial by combat. Donald Trump praised Rudy, said he did a good job, had guts for telling the crowd that we need trial by combat. Next, more attacks.
All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify, and we become president, and you are the happiest people.
This attack, like the tweets he sent that morning, had a purpose: convincing his supporters that the future of our country, of our democracy, hinged on whether Vice President Pence would overturn the election, something he knew Pence could not and would not do. He called out Vice President Pence 9 times that day. And each time, he got more forceful. Here's what he said at 12:15.
And we're going to have to fight much harder. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. Because you're sworn to uphold our Constitution. Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
We're going to have to fight much harder, and Mike Pence will have to come through for us. That's what he said. And he told the crowd what he meant and exactly what to do, literally commanding them to confront us at the Capitol. He even told them he'd walk there with them, which of course was not true. And then he told them exactly what to do when they got to the Capitol. You'll never take your country back with weakness. You have to show strength. And don't forget who is standing there. The same people Ms. Plaskett described to you. Many people violent people law enforcement had warned would be armed and would be targeting us. One of President Trump's key defenses focus on what he said for a few seconds, 15 minutes into the speech.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
In a speech spanning almost 11,000 words, yes, we did check, that was the one time, the only time President Trump used the word peaceful or any suggestion of nonviolence. The implication of the president's tweets, the rally, and the speeches were clear. President Trump used the word fight or fighting 20 times, including telling the crowd they needed to fight like hell to save our democracy. We know how the crowd responded to Donald Trump's words, and he knew how they responded to his speech. Here is the evidence of how the crowd reacted.
Here we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength.
Yes.
Leave the Capitol building. Take the Capitol. Take the Capitol. Take the Capitol. Take the Capitol. Take the Capitol right now.
We'll be marching over to the Capitol building.
Yeah.
To peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Storm the Capitol. Invade the Capitol. Fight, 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 fight. Take the Capitol right now. These were the words of the crowd. Trump was telling them to fight, and he would keep telling them to fight throughout the rest of his speech. These are not only words of aggression, they are words of insurrection. And if you have any doubt, listen to what he says next.
Today we see a very important event, though, because right over there, right there, we see the event going to take place, and I'm going to be watching because history is going to be made. We're going to see whether or not we have great and courageous leaders or whether or not we have leaders that should be ashamed of themselves throughout history, throughout eternity. They'll be ashamed. And you know what? If they do the wrong thing, we should never, ever forget that they did. Never forget. We should never, ever forget.
The commander-in-chief points to Congress and tells those assembled, I'm going to be watching. History is going to be made. This was clearly not just some rally or march or protest. This was about Donald Trump trying to steal the election for himself, claiming that the election was fraudulent, illegitimate, so that his supporters would fight to take it back. In fact, after stoking the crowd's anger for nearly 40 minutes, after repeating false election conspiracy after false election conspiracy, he said this in no uncertain terms.
You will have an illegitimate president. That's what you'll have.
Any outcome besides him keeping the presidency would be illegitimate. This was building on the big lie of a rigged and stolen election. And here's what he said a little later in the speech.
When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do.
When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. We told you that context matters. Here's the context. This was not just one reference or a message to supporters by a politician to fight for a cause. He'd assembled thousands of violent people, people he knew were capable of violence, people he had seen be violent. They were standing now in front of him. And then he pointed to us, lit the fuse, and sent an angry mob to fight the perceived enemy, his own vice president and the members of Congress, as we certified an election.
But I said, something's wrong here. Something's really wrong. Can't have happened. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Our exciting adventures and boldest endeavors have not yet begun. My fellow Americans, for our movement, for our children, and for our beloved country. And I say this, despite all that's happened, the best is yet to come. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give, the Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything. Not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being here. This is incredible. Thank you very much.
Fight for Trump! 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 What are we here for? Trump! What are we here for? Trump! Fight for Trump! Fight for Trump! Fight for Trump!
If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. And there was only one fight left, and it was a mile up the road. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, ordered the crowd to march on Congress, and so the crowd marched. This is incredible, you heard him say. That's how President Trump ended his speech. I'd like to close with a very brief timeline of what was happening in parallel alongside the president as he spoke on the 6th of January. A little after noon, President Trump began his speech with a fiery refusal to concede. He commanded the crowd to fight and march down Pennsylvania Avenue. And around 12:20, some rally goers, some attendees began marching. By 12:30, as President Trump continued to incite his supporters, large segments of the rally crowd had amassed at the Capitol. At 12:53, as the president's speech was playing on cell phone broadcasts, the outermost barricade of the northwest side of the Capitol was breached. And Capitol Police were forced back to the steps of the Capitol. At 1:10, the president ended his speech with a final call to fight and a final order to march to the Capitol. At 1:45, the president's followers surged past Capitol Police, shouting, "This is a revolution!" Just after 2:10, an hour after President Trump ended his speech, the insurrectionist mob overwhelmed Capitol security and made it inside the halls of Congress. Because the truth is, this attack never would have happened but for Donald Trump. And so they came, draped in Trump's flag, and used our flag, the American flag, to batter and to bludgeon. And at 2:30, I heard that terrifying banging on House chamber doors. For the first time in more than 200 years, the seat of our government was ransacked on our watch.
Mr. President, I think this would be a good time for a break, if that's okay.
I ask unanimous consent, we recess till 4 p.m.
Objection, hearing none, we're recessed.
4 p.m. 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock.
Lester Holt here in New York as our continuing coverage of the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump continues there, listening to Congresswoman Madeleine Dean becoming emotional near the end of her presentation, a presentation in which she seems to be drawing a sharper line between the words of President Trump on that day, January 6th, and what would occur at the Capitol itself. Let's bring in NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, and our chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Chuck, to you first, your thoughts on where we are right now.
Well, look, I mean, I'm actually struck, you know, every once in a while, as closely as we follow everything here, I learned something new in one of the presentations, and that was the timeline of the January 6th rally, and the idea that when Donald Trump tweeted about that rally that first time in December, it will be wild, that the permit then hadn't been secured yet. It's one of those hard pieces of timeline evidence that get it away from the circumstantial, right? So in many ways, a lot of these videos, you know, they're trying to make this case of intent, and I think they're doing a pretty good job, but they're still having to paste together the president's words going back to before the election. That fact, boy, anytime you can get a fact like that they have the permit, doesn't get for January 6th, doesn't happen until after he sends out that tweet about a January 6th rally, it will be wild. I think it's a pretty damning piece of evidence.
And Andrea, the thing that kept striking me at one point is some of the things that have been written leading up to this, important pieces of intelligence that seem to be missed leading up to this.
Missed leading up to this, as well as the coordination with the Proud Boys, the coordination between the Million MAGA rally on December 12th, which was violent in D.C. In fact, one of the Proud Boys founders, who had been at the White House that day on a tour, taking selfies of himself, was arrested that night and actually was in court, and then was denied the ability to come back on January 6th, but was apparently also organizing and still communicating. The fact that they had communications, we've seen some evidence of that, but the identification by Madeleine Dean, by Stacey Plaskett before her, of the communications gear in their ears, the fact that they were actually well organized, well planned, and this whole day seems to be building to the fact that this was not just a standalone event, that his tweets, 34 tweets that day, the threats against Mike Pence, which should be very persuasive to Republican senators, the threats while Mike Pence and his family were in lockdown and were under threat for their lives, that he was still threatening Mike Pence and still saying, as of course earlier at the rally, that Mike Pence has to come through for us, and if he doesn't, they'll be able to steal this election, that the whole future of our country is at stake. So putting it all on his own very loyal vice president, that certainly should be compelling to the Mitch McConnells and certainly to any wavering senators who might consider loyalty and the way Mike Pence has been, if anything, too loyal to his president, both publicly and privately, and also the private demonstrations against Mike Pence, pressuring him over and over again, leading up to that certification of the Electoral College ballots to do something to overturn the election, which he and Mike Pence knew he could not legally do.
And Chuck, so often we see hearings and impeachments where the audience is that audience at home, the public. In this case, does it matter as much how this is resonating in living rooms and kitchens across America?
Well, I think it does, because look, I think that if you were to say that the Democratic impeachment managers, right, they have a goal. They're hoping to win this case and get him barred from ever holding federal office again. Well, they may successfully argue their case, but lose the technical verdict if they've convinced a majority of the American people the former president is very guilty and doesn't deserve the opportunity for office again. So in some ways, I would argue that's sort of plan B for the impeachment managers, which if you can't win the 2/3 you need in the Senate chamber, maybe you can win 60% of the public on your side. So I do think I do think how the public reacts to this does matter.
Let me bring in Casey Hunt, who's on Capitol Hill. Casey, a little bit of housekeeping. So they started at noon today. My understanding is the House managers have 8 hours today. Do we know if they'll fill that or how the arc of this is going so far?
Lester, we do expect that they'll take most of their 8 hours today. So by that metric, we're about halfway through for the arguments today, perhaps a little less than that. But I think what we're going to see this afternoon underscores exactly what you and Chuck and Andrea have just been talking about. And the flip side of what Chuck was saying in terms of how this may impact the public and why this matters is actually how Republicans may respond to Donald Trump. And I know that some Republicans here in Congress are considering what it would mean to make President Trump a martyr were they to vote to convict him. And they think in some ways that perhaps letting this case stand the way it does will have just the effect that Chuck was outlining, and that may be the most effective way to get former President Trump permanently off the stage. But Lester, let's talk a little bit more about what else may contribute to that, because we learned this morning that the House managers are going to present new evidence, things that we've not seen before. And we have not yet seen any of that information. Everything we've gotten so far has been kind of laying out public information that we have already had. There has been one theme that has emerged every time we've seen new video out of the events of January 6th, and that is it has always seemed to underscore that we very narrowly avoided a much worse disaster, potentially even a mass casualty event. And in the week after the riot, that was the sense that permeated every new day, every new round of tape was, wow, look how much worse this could have been. And I would look to that phenomenon as something to watch for this afternoon, because demonstrating to members of Congress, members of the Senate, just how much danger they were in ways that they themselves perhaps have not even seen or are not even aware of from Capitol security cameras or other footage that we simply don't know about or aren't aware of. That is something that potentially changes minds here and also contributes to the country's broader understanding of just how close we may have come to a much worse disaster for our democracy on that day. So I think that's something to keep in mind here as we start to move from the preamble, so to speak, the lead up to the actual riot, to the president's speech, and start to talk about what actually unfolded in these halls that day, because there's still a lot that we don't know, and we do know that we are about to learn something from the manager's presentation today, Lester.
Yeah, and it is all so fresh. When we see those pieces of video, we're reminded how recently this all was. Let's bring in senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, I know you want to pick up this point, and I was thinking about it as well. The managers seem to be avoiding the elephant in the room, and that is the idea that some of the people in that room, some of those senators, even on that night after the Capitol had been secured, continued to contest the results of the election.
And Lester, I'm struck by that as part of the House impeachment manager's strategy here. In essence, trying to create some space to effectively let some of those Republican senators off the hook, so to speak. And I thought that was really highlighted by what you heard from impeachment manager Congressman Eric Swalwell, who was very explicit trying to basically tell these Republican senators what you did. And he said it almost like this, and I'm paraphrasing, what you did in order to, for those senators in the room who may have, for example, objected to the electoral vote count, was very different from what President Trump did. He basically, as you see Congressman Swalwell there, he basically was trying to say there is daylight between you two. You are not the same, because the risk, of course, for the impeachment managers is, had Democrats started painting with a broad brush in that section, it risks alienating the very de facto jurors, not that this is a criminal trial, but the very senators that they're looking to persuade over to their side. So that was an interesting strategic move by the House impeachment Democrats there, the managers. There's also something, as we have talked about this timeline here, and Chuck brought this up, it is the building of the case against Donald Trump from the perspective of the Democrats that started, before January 6th. There's been focus, obviously, on the timeline of the day, but also on the events that led up to that day, including that call from the former president, who was president at the time, to the Georgia Secretary of State. And we now know, based on some documents that our team has gotten their hands on, that there is a criminal investigation that has been opened into what exactly went down surrounding that phone call, an investigation that is including but not limiting to, and I'm reading from this here, a law that prohibits the solicitation of election fraud, basically. Remember, this is a call, as has been reported and was discussed on the floor of the Senate here, in which President Trump, who was in office at the time, called up the Georgia Secretary of State and said, I want you to find the votes. Remember this one, find one more vote than what I lost by in Georgia, a state that, of course, President Biden won by roughly 11,000 some votes. There is now fallout that is going to extend beyond this impeachment trial related to that phone call, Lester.
Hallie, thank you. Former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official and NBC News contributor Chuck Rosenberg joins us. Also, NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. Carol, let me start with here. We heard Congresswoman Dean a moment ago, and as I mentioned, seemed to be drawing a sharper line between the words of Donald Trump that day and what occurred at the Capitol. My question to you, is the line sharp enough? Nowhere do we ever hear the president say, hey, leave here, go to the Capitol and attack it. He doesn't say that.
Yeah, when you're getting ready to try a case, or even when you're in the middle of a trial as a prosecutor, you often wonder, are the juries really believing what they're hearing from the defense's mouth here? Are they naive, or are they sophisticated? Are they understanding what's going on here? And when I hear that tape played with Donald Trump saying the word peaceful, pointed out that it was used once in that 70-minute long speech, I almost could hear an aide, or perhaps Rudy Giuliani or somebody saying to him, or even the president himself thinking, I better stick the word peaceful in there, even though that's not what I want, that's not what I hope, because I'll be able to trot that out later as a defense. And this is not an unsophisticated audience that is hearing this case, and I think they understand what was going on there. I thought that what was new for me here was hearing the feedback from the rally, people saying, take the Capitol, get to the Capitol, breach the Capitol. That I had not heard before, and it shows us what was happening in the crowd at that time, what perhaps the president was hearing at the time, and that is very significant to me. So to me, it's enough. I don't know if it'll be enough for people who have already made up their minds otherwise.
Yeah, Chuck, we heard a lot of the broad strokes here of the attack and what led up to it. And frankly, most of them, I think these senators and most of us had heard before. But taken in its collective nature as it's been processed, do you feel like you've heard something new, something that could tilt the needle one way or the other?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, Lester. What we're hearing, or better said, what we're seeing is a tapestry. And the best prosecutors in the most difficult cases, people like Carol Lamb, weave a tapestry for the jury. Let me give you a simple example, but I don't think it's oversimple. A bank robbery. It takes place on a particular day. And so when you charge a bank robbery, you charge that a bank has been robbed, let's say, on January 6th. But there's a whole bunch of things that happened before and after. Maybe two people conspire to rob the bank. Maybe they buy a getaway car. Maybe they surveil or case the bank. That happens before. After the bank robbery, maybe they intimidate a witness so as not to speak to the FBI. Maybe they hide the money. Maybe they burn the ski mask that they wore in the bank. And so that tapestry, in a simple case, a bank robbery, or in a very complex case like this one, helps illustrate for your jury all of the things that happened. And what the prosecution team is doing here is weaving an extraordinary tapestry. People who have followed it closely, like me, like Carol Lamb, like your reporters, are all hearing new things. We've thought we kept up with each piece of it, but in fact, until you see it spread out on a table and put in a timeline, you don't realize just how dangerous the president's words were and how closely people were following them. I agree completely with Carol. This is a strong, strong case. Whether or not it results in a conviction or an acquittal, well, that's up to 100 people. It's not up to us. And there are probably some purely political reasons why that jury would acquit. But I will tell you, it cannot be for a lack of evidence. The evidence is overwhelming.
But in this case, the defense yesterday was very quick to stipulate, yeah, we know it happened. We know he said those things. We know the people attacked. They're going to look at a very, very narrow question. That is, did he say the right combination of words that would prove that he incited this riot and this attack?
Yes, that's right, Lester. I think there are probably two defenses that they will offer, and they are related. One, to your point, did he actually incite a riot? Did his words evince, prove, demonstrate his intent for that thing at the Capitol to happen? But again, that's why the prosecutors are going through all of this. They're weaving that tapestry. Second, I think the defense will argue that his speech was First Amendment protected. Maybe it is and maybe it's not. It doesn't matter. This is not a criminal trial, and he's not charged with violating or with, frankly, adhering to the First Amendment. He's charged with inciting a riot. By the way, words that incite riots that lead to imminent threats of violence or a clear and present danger are not First Amendment protected. But this is an impeachment trial, not a criminal trial. And so I think your question is an important one. I think the defense will try and poke at it in those two ways. But in the end, again, Lester, the evidence here is absolutely overwhelming. They will do what good defense attorneys do. They will try to poke holes. They will hope that some of those pokes bring some senators along. That's all they need. They need 17 or 18 senators from the Republican side, and they win.
And Carol, we also heard in there this idea that the president had some involvement in the planning of this event. Might there be surprises there? Might we hear more on that?
Well, what we've heard already is surprising enough to me. They've got a lot of time left, and I think this prosecution team has actually planned this all very well. They understand not to overstep grounds. They understand not to say the same things over and over and over again that is going to be wearying to the audience. So I suspect that they have more surprises in hand. But what Chuck was saying is very important, this tapestry and the Orwellian nature of all of this, watching these crowds reaching our center of democracy while wrapped in the American flag and the name of the president creates such an Orwellian situation, nightmarish, really. And if the senators don't appreciate that, it will be very disappointing because it's really quite shocking.
Carol and Chuck, thanks. We're going to pause for a brief moment as some stations leave us for local coverage. Then we will continue our conversation. All right, we're back with continuing NBC News coverage of the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. I want to turn now to NBC News political analyst and former Democratic Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill. Claire, how do you think this is going, and do you anticipate we're going to hear some things we haven't heard before?
Well, they have built a wall of evidence brick by brick. And I want to say, Lester, one important brick that was brought out today, and this is really going to be on the minds of senators particularly, is the failure of the president to condemn violence. His wink, wink, nod, nod to the Proud Boys, to stand back and stand by. His failure to ever speak out against violent behavior by any of the people who were threatening people around the country, including those who were arrested for trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan. And why is that important? It's important because of his conduct after the attack began. After those senators were afraid for their lives, after those members of Congress were afraid for their lives and notifying their families to tell them they loved them, the president did nothing. And reports are, and I think we're going to hear a lot more evidence on this, about his conduct between the time the riot began and when he finally, 5 hours later, said something close to stop. That is really what I think is going to be hardest for the president's lawyers to explain away, how he behaved after the attack was underway.
And how do we continue to look at emotion as part of this equation? We saw that rough 13 minutes yesterday in that video, and we're told there may be more, even more compelling and graphic video. At the end of the day, virtually everybody in those chambers was in those chambers on the 6th and has their own awful story to tell. So do you think that will ultimately drive where this trial goes?
Every trial has a lot of emotion in it. This one has particularly a lot of emotion in it. When you see police officers beaten with people using American flags as bayonets against police officers who are trying to protect our Capitol, it's going to get emotional. And you can see the managers try to hold it together when they recall how they felt that day. And I can assure you, having talked to many of the senators, those feelings are shared by those senators listening to that evidence today.
All right, Senator, thanks very much. I want to bring in senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson again. Hallie's been working the phones. What are you hearing from the former president's team as they watch this unfold?
Well, it's something that relates to the conversation that you were just having, Lester, with Chuck Rosenberg, when you asked about that line, right, that sort of connection between what the former president said, the language that he used, the combination of words that he was using. What I think you will see from the defense team, based on what we are seeing so far from Donald Trump's defenders, is an attempt to link similar language to some of the very Democrats who are making the case on the House impeachment management team. So people like, for example, Congressman Ted Lieu, who you heard from, Congressman Eric Swalwell, lead impeachment manager, Congressman Jamie Raskin, using words in the sort of political universe like fight, like tackle, like fight like hell, trying to make the case that it's a rather semantic case, but that this is metaphorical language. That's an argument that we saw laid out in the former president's defense team's legal brief earlier this week, and that it was not intentional or literal. Now, there is, I think, an open question on how the senators receiving this information will take it, given that obviously there was no siege on the Capitol in the moments after those other politicians made comments like those, and the context was obviously very different. But it does give you some insight into perhaps some video that we may see when the defense team gets their opportunity to argue their up to 16 hours. There have been some heavy hints that that is on the radar, Lester.
All right, let me bring Chuck back into the conversation. And a political question here. Chuck, how does this weigh on the Democrats and Republicans right now? Will this be a defining moment for either party, depending on how this goes?
Look, I think this is a defining moment for the Republican Party, because even though in some ways we've already learned that Donald Trump has won this battle, this first battle in the post-Trump era, who's going to run the party? Trump or somebody else? Well, right now it's Trump's in charge. And the only way that changes is if there is a verdict of guilty and he is convicted. And that would then change the conversation and maybe even raise the stakes more. But even if he's acquitted, there is still going to be a raging debate about what to do about Donald Trump. You're still going to have. So I do think that in this sense, what happens here, I mean, if they don't deal with Donald Trump now, he'll be harder to deal with in the GOP in 6 months. And if they don't deal with it in 6 months, he'll be harder to deal with it in 2 years. And so if they don't want Donald Trump leading their party in 2022 and 2024, this may be their last chance to stop that. But I don't know if all those Republicans in that Senate chamber believe Donald Trump is universally not an asset. I think there's quite a few folks that think there's still something to be gained about associating with Donald Trump and the GOP. But maybe there are 17 or 18 who disagree. We'll
right. And Andrea Mitchell, we recall not too long ago, one of the arguments against having an impeachment was that it would ruin any chance at unity as we watch a new administration take off. What about that?
Well, I think that is an issue, but the counter argument is that there had to be accountability, that this was too egregious, especially the web of facts that have been presented by these impeachment managers, which was known to a lot of people on the Hill, all of the organization, the backstory, the denial of the election returns, that you just could not ignore it, that they had, once they impeached, you had to proceed to a trial. So that just was an automatic fact. And they'll get some business done. They've already scheduled the hearing for Merrick Garland, who, of course, has gone 6 years without ever getting a hearing, without even having a meeting with any of the Republicans on the Hill when he was nominated for the Supreme Court. So that's going to be on January 22nd, now that Dick Durbin is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, not Lindsey Graham. So things are going to get done. It's going to get done, barely with a majority, but there is support for some of the COVID relief. You've seen that already. There's going to be some Republicans who will vote for the Biden packages, and otherwise they're going to just have to do it with 51 votes, try to hold Joe Manchin and have the vice president really tied down in the Senate rather than traveling the world, which he would not be doing now during pandemic anyway. I think that there are real fissures, though, to your question, that will not be healed easily. The Josh Crawleys, the Ted Cruzes, and they clearly have ambitions to run for president, and they are carving out a territory which is tied to the Trump legacy. Josh Hawley, by the way, according to our team, during much of today's procedure was not in his seat, was not attentive, was up in the gallery, the Senate gallery, so in the chamber, but up above, across from where the press sits. And according to our press team that was there, was very much doing other paperwork and not paying attention to the proceedings. And apparently said when he came down at one point during a break, there was no point in paying attention because it's all over, that the verdict is decided. Overheard saying that to one of his colleagues.
Yeah, the gavel has fallen. I don't know if they're quite ready. So let me try to sneak in one more question. I was talking to Hallie a while ago. There's been no shaming, active shaming by the managers of Republicans who continued to support not counting the ballots. Oops, I'm sorry, I was trying to get. I was putting that question to Andrea, but go ahead, Hallie.
I thought so. No, Andrea can certainly pick it up there because I think that you're right. Yeah, that's a point that I think you and I discussed, and it is notable. I'm curious as to Andrea's thoughts.
Yeah, I think that it clearly did not work at the last impeachment, Hallie and Lester, because that backfire that caused a lot of anger against some of the impeachment managers last time. So I think that they are being very careful, very diplomatic. You saw going in today, Jamie Raskin saying that there are a lot of open minds, that they're not yet decided, which sort of flies in the face of the 45 votes against even declaring it constitutional yesterday.
So it's almost 4:10 here in the East. They're going to go a little while. We know they're planning on taking a dinner break around 6 o'clock before proceeding into at least the early evening. The House managers working with an 8-hour window here today to begin making their case again. Yesterday was the day that they voted on the question of constitutionality. Without that out of the way, we are in the heart of this trial. House managers again trying to make the point and convince these senators that the president incited the riot and the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. To that end, we're hearing the gavel fall.
Please.
Thank you, Mr.
Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate. At this point, Representatives Plaskett and Swalwell will take you through the actual day of the attack. They will recreate the attack as it unfolded, focusing on the threats to Vice President Pelosi, Vice President Pence, Speaker Pelosi, the joint session, and law enforcement. I do want to alert everyone that there is some very graphic, violent footage coming, just so people are aware. And I'm going to call again on Ms. Plaskett, who I should also tell you went to work at the Department of Justice and was the senior counsel for Deputy Attorney General Larry Thompson under Attorney General Ashcroft. So she's a very well-trained and experienced prosecutor, as you can tell.
Mr. President, senators, almost all of us were here on January 6th, and we all have our individual experiences, what we felt, what we saw, what we heard. We've seen clips and reports in the media, but I have to tell you, it was not until preparing for this trial that I understood the full scope and learned the information that you're going to see, that I understood the effort to attack our seat of government in order to carry out President Trump's mission to prevent the certification of a presidential election. It was an attack to our republic, to our democratic process. My colleagues, Manager Swalwell and I, are going to walk you through the attack on the Capitol that day and the danger that it posed to the Vice President, to the Speaker of the House, to you all as senators, my colleagues in the House, Capitol Police, and everyone who works in and around this Capitol. As you have heard, President Trump had been telling his supporters and his millions of Twitter followers that Pence had the ability to secure the presidency for Trump, that Mike Pence alone had the power to overturn the election results if he would just do it. But at 12:55 p.m. on January 6th, Vice President Pence formally refused the president's demand. He wrote, and I quote, "It is my considered judgment that my oath to support and defend the Constitution constrains me from claiming unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not." Pence ended his letter with a passage including the words, "I will do my duty." Even though the count resulted in the defeat of his party and his own candidacy, Vice President Pence had the courage to stand against the president, tell the American public the truth, and uphold our Constitution. That is patriotism. That patriotism is also what put Vice President in so much danger on January 6th by the mob sent by our president. To the president and the mob he incited, that duty to our Constitution was an all-out betrayal. And the vice president was the direct target of that rage. At 12:53 p.m., senators, members of Congress, Vice President Pence were in their respective chambers. Outside, rioters, including some linked to the Proud Boys, broke through the outer barricade surrounding the lawn of the Capitol. Minutes later, Vice President Pence began presiding over the joint session of Congress to certify the results of the presidential election. You can see Vice President Pence gaveling in the joint session here.
Madam Speaker and members of Congress, pursuant to the Constitution and the laws of the United States. The Senate and House of Representatives are meeting in joint session to verify the certificates and count the votes of the electors of the several states for President and Vice President of the United States.
While Vice President Pence presided over the joint session, Trump supporters began their assault on our Capitol. Radio communications from the Metropolitan Police Department highlight how during and following President Trump's speech, Trump supporters descended on the Capitol and became increasingly violent. What you are about to hear has not been made public before.
Multiple capital injuries! Multiple capital injuries!
1318.
Hey, 12 to 50, we're coming around from the south side.
Be advised, the speech ended.
Intel 1, be advised, you got a group of about 50 charging up the hill on the west front, just north of the stairs. They're approaching the wall now. They're starting to dismantle the reviewing stand and throwing metal poles at us. Cruiser 50, give me DSO up here now! DSO! Multiple law enforcement entries! DSO, get up here! All right, we're 30 seconds out. We need some reinforcements up here now. They're starting to pull the gates down. They're throwing metal poles at us. Cruiser 50, DSO, get up here! Okay, we're here. 12 to 50, we're here. We just had an explosion go on up here. I know there's fireworks. There was, but they're starting to explode explosives. Fireworks material.
After attempting to dismantle the outermost perimeter, the rioters did everything in their power to storm past the police and into the Capitol. They coordinated moving metal barricades the police were using to maintain distance. Listen to the yelling of "pull them this way" as they grabbed the barriers and attacked officers trying to hold the line.
Hold them this way! Hold them!
At about 1:10 and 1:23 p.m., respectively, Capitol Police sent out the first evacuation alerts of the day, telling people to evacuate the Madison Building and the Cannon Building, respectively. Shortly after, at 1:45 p.m., Trump supporters surged past Capitol Police, protecting the Capitol's west steps, the side that is facing the White House. In another radio communication between Metropolitan Police officers, you can hear an officer declare that there is a riot at the Capitol at 1:49 p.m.
Cruiser 50, we're going to give riot warnings as soon as the apparatus is here. We're going to give riot warnings. We're going to try and get compliance, but this is now effectively a riot.
1349 hours, declaring it a riot.
The next video, as well as several videos that follow, have a model of the Capitol complex. The video is from the west front of the Capitol on the Senate side, the side facing the White House. Watch the red dot, which moves up the lower steps of the Capitol, indicating the approximate location of the rioters as they surge past the police. While the mob that Donald Trump sent to stop the certification came closer and closer to breaching the Capitol just one floor below where we are now, Vice President Pence continued to preside over the session in the Senate chamber above. At about 2:12 p.m., Secret Service quickly and suddenly evacuated Vice President Pence from the Senate floor. Here's the immediate reaction to that evacuation.
No audio. They just cut out. It looks like they and sometimes the Senate.
Like they just ushered Mike Pence out really quickly.
Yes, they did. That's exactly what just happened there. They ushered Mike Pence out. They moved him fast. I saw the motions too.
While the Vice President Pence was being evacuated from the Senate chamber, rioters were at that time breaking into the Capitol. This next video shows their approach and the initial breach of the Capitol complex. Remember to watch the red dot, which Broke is being tracking throughout this incident. Now we're going to show you, through security footage that has not been made public before, what that same breach looked like from the inside. Now, because this is security footage, there's no sound. Note, as the video begins, we are seeing the inside view as the mob approaches from outside and beats the windows and doors. You can see that the rioter first break the window with the wooden beam that you saw previously, and a lone police officer inside responds and begins to spray the first man who enters, but is quickly overwhelmed. I want you to pay attention to the first group of assailants as they break into the building. The second man through the window is wearing full tactical body armor and is carrying a baseball bat. Others are carrying riot shields. Among this group are members of the Proud Boys, some of whom, like Dominic Pizzola, who was recently indicted on federal conspiracy charges, we will discuss later. Can watch where they're coming on our model as well. When I first saw this model that was created for this, I thought back to September 11th. I know a lot of you senators were here. Some of you might have been members on the House side. I was also here on September 11th. I was a staffer at that time. My office was on the west front of the Capitol. I worked in the Capitol, and I was on the House side. This year is 20 years since the attacks of September 11th. And almost every day, I remember that 44 Americans gave their lives to stop the plane that was headed to this Capitol building. I thank them every day for saving my life and the life of so many others. Those Americans sacrificed their lives for love of country, honor, duty, all the things that America means. The Capitol stands because of people like that. This Capitol that was conceived by our founding fathers, that was built by slaves, that remains through the sacrifice of service men and women around the world. And when I think of that, and I think of these insurgents, these images incited by our own President of the United States, attacking this Capitol to stop the certification of a presidential election, our democracy, our republic. At the same time that that breach on this Capitol building occurred, at approximately 2:13 p.m., just one floor up, while Senator Lankford was speaking on the Senate floor, Senator Grassley, who had taken over for Vice President Pence, called an unscheduled immediate recess of the Senate. A Senate aide approached Senator Lankford and informed him that the Capitol had been breached. Senator Grassley is immediately escorted out of the Senate chamber.
We'll pause. Protesters are in the building. Thank you.
Now, while this was going on, Officer Eugene Goodman responded to the initial breach. You all may have seen footage of Officer Goodman previously, but there's more to his heroic story. In this security footage, you can see Officer Goodman running to respond to the initial breach. Officer Goodman passes Senator Mitt Romney and directs him to turn around in order to get to safety. On the first floor, just beneath them, the mob had already started to search for the Senate chamber. Officer Goodman made his way down to the first floor where he encountered the same insurrectionists we just saw watch breach the Capitol. In this video, we can see the rioters surge toward Officer Goodman. Recall that the rioters are in red and Officer Goodman in this model is in blue. Watch Officer Goodman, who backs up the stairs. Although they were shouting that they did not have any weapons, we know from the earlier video that that's not true. The second assailant through that breach was the one carrying a metal baseball bat. We know there were other weapons there that day. Did you hear the other shouts? We're here for you. He's one person, we're thousands. And where do they count the votes? They were coming at the urging of Donald Trump to keep Congress, a separate branch of government, from certifying the results of a presidential election. As the rioters reached the top of the stairs, they were within 100 feet of where the vice president was sheltering with his family. And they were just a feet away from one of the doors to this chamber, where many of you remained at that time. I also want to show you a different angle from the security footage of Officer Goodman's acts. This video is on the second floor of the Senate wing of the Capitol. The red dot, as you recall, represents the insurrectionists. The blue dot is Officer Goodman, who led the mob away from the chamber just minutes earlier. On the left-hand side of the video, just inside the hallway, is the door to the Senate chamber. And watch how Officer Goodman provokes the rioters and purposefully draws them away from the door to the Senate chamber and towards the other officers waiting down the hall. The rioter seen carrying a baseball bat in this video is the same one we saw moments ago breaching the window on the first floor. While all of this was going on, Vice President Pence was still in the room near the Senate chamber. It was not until 2:26 that he was evacuated to a secure location. This next security video shows that evacuation. His movements are depicted by the orange dot in our model. The red and blue dots represents the location where the mob and Officer Goodman were, and where Officer Goodman led the mob away from the chamber just moments ago. You can see Vice President Pence and his family quickly move down the stairs. The Vice President turns around briefly as he's headed down. As Pence was being evacuated, rioters started to spread throughout the Capitol. Those inside helped other rioters break in through doors in several locations around this entire building. And the mob was looking for Vice President Pence because of his patriotism, because the vice president had refused to do what the president demanded and overturn the election results. During the assault on the Capitol, extremists reportedly coordinated online and discussed how they could hunt down the vice president. Journalists in the Capitol reported they heard rioters say they were looking for Pence in order to execute him. Trump's supporters had erected a gallows on the lawn in front of the Capitol building. Another group of rioters chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," as they stood in the open door of the Capitol building. You can hear the security alarm from the door in the background, and you can hear the mob calling for the death of the Vice President of the United States. This wasn't an isolated area or incident where that was being told, where that was being said. It was going on everywhere. Here's another example of the crowd outside yelling, "Bring out Pence! Bring him out!"
Bring him out! Bring him out! Bring out Pence! Bring him out! Bring out Pence! Bring him out! Bring out Pence!
after President Trump had primed his followers for months and inflamed the rally-goers that morning, it is no wonder that the Vice President of the United States was the target of their wrath after Pence refused to overturn the election results. Listen to this man explain.
Well, Congress, the cowards hid in their inside and were emergency escorted away because of fear of the people. Of course, they're cowards, can't face the people, can't do the right thing. Pence lied to us. He's a total treasonous pig, and his name will be mud forever. Now the real battle begins, and it looks like the American people are very pissed. So, good luck with that. Peace out.
Peace out. Several insurrectionists described what they had planned to do if they encountered the vice president or other lawmakers. One of them, Dominic Pizzola, also known as Spaz, is a member of the Proud Boys, as we discussed. Pizzola came to the Capitol on January 6 with deadly intentions. He commandeered a Capitol Police shield, used it to smash a glass window, entered the Capitol, and paved the way for dozens of insurrectionists. As you recall from an earlier video, Pizzola was one of the first wave of rioters to breach the building. On the left, you can see a screenshot from the video of the break-in we showed earlier. And on the right, you can see Pizzola in the mob chase Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman through the building. Pizzola is the man in the center of the photo with the gray beard. Pizzola has since been charged with 8 federal crimes for his conduct related to January 6. According to an FBI agent's affidavit submitted to the court, the group that was with him during the sack of the Capitol confirmed that they were out to murder, quote, anyone they got their hands on. Here's what the FBI said, and I quote, other members of the group talked about things they had done that day, and they said that anyone they got their hands on, they would have killed, including Nancy Pelosi, and that, quote, they would have killed Vice President Mike Pence if given the chance. They were talking about assassinating the Vice President of the United States. During the course of the attack, the Vice President never left the Capitol, remained locked down with his family inside the building. Remember that as you think about these images and the sounds of the attack. The Vice President, our second in command, was always at the center of it. Vice President Pence was threatened with death by the president's supporters because he rejected President Trump's demand that he overturn the election. The mob also went after Speaker of the House, who alongside the Vice President was presiding over the joint session of the certification in the House chamber. The chilling evidence shows that on January 6th, armed and organized insurrectionists trained their sights on Speaker Pelosi. They sought out the Speaker on the floor and in her office, publicly declared their intent to harm or kill her, ransacked her office, and terrorized her staff. And they did it because Donald Trump sent them on this mission. As the insurrectionists got closer, Capitol Police rushed the Speaker from the House floor at 2:15 p.m., mere minutes after the Capitol was first breached. They recognized immediately that she was in danger. The Speaker was not just rushed from the floor. The Capitol Police deemed the threat so dangerous that they evacuated her entirely from the Capitol complex, rushing her to a secure off-site location. The insurrectionist intent to murder the Speaker of the House is well documented in charging documents that are now available. We know from the rioters themselves that if they had found Speaker Pelosi, they would have killed her. I have already discussed Proud Boys member Dominic Pizzola, who has since been charged with 8 federal crimes for his conduct on January 6. As you will recall, according to the FBI agent's affidavit submitted to the court, the group he attacked the Capitol with confirmed that, quote, anyone they got their hands on, they would have killed, including Nancy Pelosi. William Calhoun, a lawyer from Georgia, also participated in the insurrection that day, and he too has been charged for his actions. This insurrectionist detailed his criminal activity at the Capitol online. Calhoun wrote about his involvement on his own Facebook page. Here's the post. Calhoun stated, quote, and get this, the first of us who got upstairs kicked in Nancy Pelosi's office door and pushed down the halls towards her inner sanctum. The mob howling with rage. Crazy Nancy probably would have been torn into little pieces, but she was nowhere to be seen. Crazy Nancy. That's Trump's nickname for the Speaker of the House. Then he explains that he and his group only abandoned their claim to the Speaker's office when, quote, a SWAT team showed up. He writes, quote, then a SWAT team showed and we retreated back to the rotunda and continued our hostile takeover of the Capitol building. Retreated, hostile takeover. He's using military terms for this attack. The mob continued to look for Speaker Pelosi throughout the time they occupied the Capitol, including invading her offices. Watch now how the mob searches for Speaker Pelosi's office, which is marked in red, and the House chamber itself.
Where are you, Nancy? We're looking for you. Nancy! Oh, Nancy! Nancy! Where are you, Nancy?
During the siege, the Speaker's staff took cover in her office, hiding in fear for their lives for hours as rioters broke in and ransacked her office. As the rioters were breaking into the Capitol, her staff retreated into an interior room. 8 of them gathered in a conference room. About the same time, Capitol Police announced that Capitol had been breached. Speaker Pelosi's staff heeded the call to shelter in place. On our model, you can see the rioters in the rotunda in red and the Speaker's office again in orange. So this is a security video, so there is no sound. As you can see here, the staff moves from their offices through the halls and then enters a door on the right-hand side. That's the outer door of a conference room, which also has an inner door that they barricaded with furniture. The staff then hid under a conference room table in that inner room. This is the last staffer going in and then barricading themselves inside of the inner office. After just 7 minutes of them barricading themselves and the last staffer entering the door on the right, a group of rioters enter the hallway outside. And once inside, the rioters have free reign in the Speaker of the House's offices. In this security video, pay attention to the door that we saw those staffers leading into and going into. One of the rioters you can see is throwing his body against the door 3 times until he breaks open that outer door. Luckily, when faced with the inner door, he moves on. Another rioter later tried, unsuccessfully, to break through that inner door. At this point, the mob had already broken into the Speaker's formal conference room that is in the back of the hall at the top of the video. I want to play some audio we have of the Speaker's staff with the rioters at the door that day. You can hear the terror in their voice as they describe what's happening to them as they are barricaded in that conference room. Please listen carefully, because the staffer is whispering into a phone as he hides from the rioters that are outside the door.
Texting Mike that they're within our hallway. We need Capitol Police, I think, coming to the hallway. They're pounding on doors trying to find her. Yeah.
You can hear the pounding in the background as that staffer is speaking. One of those staffers explained later that they could hear the mob going through her offices, breaking down the door and yelling, "Where are you, Nancy?" The mob also pillaged and vandalized the Speaker's office and documented their crimes on social media. They stole objects, desecrated the office of the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States. As you can see in these photos, rioters broke down a door. They also shattered a mirror. At 2:50 p.m., several rioters, including Richard Big O Barnett, entered Speaker Pelosi's office. The world is all now too familiar with the images from these slides. If you look closely, however, at the now infamous pictures of Barnett with his feet on the desk, you might see something that you didn't notice previously. Here's a better look. As this photo highlights, he's carrying a stun gun tucked into his waistband. The FBI identified the device as a 950,000-volt stun gun walking stick. The weapon could have caused serious pain and incapacitated anyone Barnett had used it against. Richard Barnett bragged about his actions. He was proud of the way he desecrated the Speaker of the House's office. He left a note: "We will not back down." Here's Barnett in his own words.
Office? How'd you get it? I didn't steal it. I bled on it because they were fucking macing me and I couldn't fucking see. And so I figured, well, I'm in her office. I got blood in her office. I'll put a quarter on her desk, even though she ain't fucking worth it. And I left her a note on her desk that says, "Nancy Big O is here, you bitch."
Trump's mob ransacked the Speaker of the House's office. They terrorized her staff. Again, that is a mob that was sent by the President of the United States to stop the certification of an election. The Vice President, the Speaker of the House, the first and second in line to the presidency, were performing their constitutional duties, presiding over the election certification, and they were put in danger because President Trump put his own desires, his own need for power over his duty to the Constitution and our democratic process. President Trump put a target on their backs, and his mob broke into the Capitol to hunt them down.
Protect us. We need you to work right. Our chairs. Hey, staff, we need you. We're surrounded. They breached the scaffold. Like nothing now, they have breached the scaffold. They're behind our lines.
Shortly after 2 p.m., the Capitol Police and Metropolitan Police were overwhelmed by President Trump's mob. Perimeters were broken. The Capitol had been breached. Those officers kept fighting back for hours and hours to hold the line. They fought to defend the Capitol building and all of us within it. But they weren't there just to protect us, and they did, and our staff, and the custodial staff, and all the people who work so hard in this building. They were there to protect the votes of the American people that were being counted that day. I will show you more later about what that day was like for those brave officers. But first, let's go back to what was happening where Manager Plaskett left off in the House chamber. Rioters who had entered the building through the Senate quickly spread out through the Capitol. Many headed towards the House and Senate chambers. After Speaker Pelosi was ushered out, Chairman McGovern was presiding in the House, attempting to keep the counting process going. On our phones, members were receiving security updates and watching social media to see the horror that was going on outside. We never thought it would make its way in. By 2:25 p.m., rioters who were already in the building opened the east side doors of the Capitol Rotunda to let more of the mob in. They quickly flooded through the doors, overwhelming the officers. This is new security footage of those doors. And as before, the mob is identified with the red dot on the model of the Capitol. If you look closely, you'll see the first person through the door is holding a Trump flag. At the same time, just one floor below, the mob violently pushed through a line of Capitol police officers and overtook the area. We all know that area in the Capitol is the crypt. This is directly beneath the rotunda, at the very center of the Capitol. Inside the House chamber, a security officer suspended the floor debate to update members.
We had a disbursement of tear gas in the rotunda. Please be advised there are masks under your seats. Please grab a mask, place it in your lap, and be prepared to don your mask in the event that we get a breach.
We were told there were tear gas masks underneath our seats and be prepared to grab them. Determined to keep the count going, Chairman McGovern called the House back into session. But only 4 minutes later, at 2:30 p.m., the House abruptly recessed. A new security announcement was made.
Get down under your chairs if necessary, so we have folks entering the rotunda and coming down this way. So we'll update you as soon as we can, but just be prepared. Stay calm. As
I heard that announcement on the floor, I saw the new House chaplain, on just her 4th day on the job, walk to the front podium. Unannounced and amidst the chaos, she started to recite a prayer for peace. Uncertain what would happen next, I sent a text message to my wife. I love you and the babies. Please hug them for me. I imagine many of you sent a similar message. What we could not see from inside the chamber was that outside the mob was growing larger and larger and approaching our doors. But we could hear them. This security footage, which does not have sound, shows a close-up of Trump's mob as they move toward the 2nd floor of the House chamber to stop the counting of votes. In the back of the group, you see one individual carrying a Stop the Steal sign. They get within footsteps of the House door. The next video is the viewpoint of the insurrectionists. It begins with the mob amassing and then cuts ahead to show you their surge to the House door.